You've spoken to thousands of people in your life, laughed with them, argued, shared silence, and in all that time, you've only ever experienced one consciousness, yours. Everyone else, you've never been inside their heads, not once, not ever. Right now, as you're listening to this, there's an experience happening, thoughts forming, attention shifting, maybe the faint awareness of your breathing or the weight of your head against a pillow. That's consciousness, your consciousness. And it's the only one you can be absolutely certain exists. The person you spoke to today, the face you saw on a screen, the voice on the phone, they responded perfectly. They laughed at the right moments. Their eyes looked alive. But here's the unsettling part. You can't actually prove they were experiencing anything at all. They could have been empty inside, performing without presence, reacting without awareness. Philosophers call these hypothetical beings philosophical zombies, creatures identical to humans in every physical way, behaving exactly as we do, yet possessing no inner light, no felt experience, know what it's like to be them. Just darkness where consciousness should be. And the truly strange thing, there's no test you could run to tell the difference. No scan, no question, no measurement. Because consciousness doesn't leave physical evidence beyond behavior, and behavior can be faked, or at least we can't prove it can't be. This isn't paranoia. It's one of philosophy's oldest puzzles, and we're going to explore it together tonight. Not to make you anxious, but to examine something quietly extraordinary, the strange faith we place in other minds, the mystery of experience itself, and what it means to build a world on assumptions we can never verify. So settle in, let the day fall away. We're about to take a gentle journey into one of the deepest questions you can ask. How do you know anyone else is home? When you look into someone's eyes during a conversation, something happens. You read emotion there, connection, understanding. The slight narrowing that suggests concentration, the softening that signals empathy, the spark that indicates what? Presence? Consciousness? The sense that someone is truly there, behind those eyes, experiencing the moment alongside you. But stop and consider what you're actually observing. Light reflects off a curved surface. Muscles contract and relax according to neural signals. Pupils dilate or constrict based on light levels and arousal states. None of this, strictly speaking, proves awareness. A sufficiently sophisticated robot could produce the same effects. In fact, some already do. The assumption we make that this behavior indicates inner experience is so automatic, so deeply wired, that questioning it feels almost absurd. When someone winces and pulls their hand from a hot surface, crying out in apparent pain, every instinct tells you they're hurting, that they're feeling something. But the philosophical problem cuts deeper than instinct. What you're witnessing is a chain of physical events, heat receptors firing, signals traveling up nerves, brain regions activating, muscles contracting, vocalizations emerging. Each step can be described mechanically as a pattern of electrochemical activity, and nowhere in that chain does consciousness necessarily appear. The whole sequence could theoretically run without anyone home to experience it. This is the problem of other minds, first clearly articulated in its modern form centuries ago, but probably felt intuitively by every human who ever wondered whether others truly understood them. We are locked inside our own skulls. Your experience is radically private. You have complete and immediate access to your own thoughts, sensations, and feelings. But everyone else, you get behavior, expressions, words, actions, never direct access to what's happening inside. Even the most intimate relationships involve this gap. When someone says, "I love you," you hear sounds shaped by a larynx and tongue. You might see tears, feel a touch, observe a pattern of care over time. All evidence, all behavior, but the feeling itself, the subjective experience of love in that person's consciousness, remains forever beyond your reach. You can never feel what they feel, see their red as they see it, inhabit their perspective even for an instant, and here's where it gets stranger. This limitation is absolute. It's not a matter of better technology or deeper scientific understanding. Even if you could map every neuron in someone's brain, track every chemical interaction, predict their every response, you still wouldn't have accessed their consciousness. You'd have perfect knowledge of the mechanism without ever touching the mystery of experience. So we navigate the world making a constant necessary assumption that the behavior we observe indicates consciousness similar to our own, that behind every face is a felt inner life. But assumption isn't proof. And occasionally, in quiet moments, the question surfaces, what if I'm wrong? René Descartes sat by a fire in 1641, trying to doubt everything he possibly could. Could he doubt the existence of the external world? Yes, perhaps he was dreaming, or deceived by some malicious entity. Could he doubt mathematics? Even that seemed shakeable. Could he doubt his own body? Certainly he might be a disembodied mind, fed false sensory information, but then he arrived at something he couldn't doubt. Even if he was being deceived, even if everything he perceived was illusion, the very act of doubting proved something existed to do the doubting. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Not I have a body or I perceive accurately, but simply something is experiencing these thoughts, and therefore that something exists. It's remarkably certain. Right now you might doubt whether you're really lying in bed, or if this is an elaborate simulation. You might question whether your memories are accurate, or if the world began 5 minutes ago with false history implanted. But you can't coherently doubt that experience is happening. Thoughts are occurring. Awareness exists. Even the thought, maybe I don't exist, is itself a form of existence. Something is having that thought. This certainty is absolute, but also absolutely limited. It stops at the boundary of your own mind. Descartes knew he existed, but what about his servant, the people in the street below? His own certainty couldn't extend to them. He saw bodies moving, heard sounds that seemed like language, observed behavior that suggested thought. But technically, logically, rigorously, he couldn't prove consciousness animated those bodies rather than mere mechanism. He ended up arguing that only God's goodness guaranteed other minds existed, that a benevolent creator wouldn't deceive him by populating the world with unconscious automatons. But notice the move. He had to leave philosophy and enter faith. The logical proof alone couldn't bridge the gap. Centuries of philosophers since have tried to improve on this situation. They've offered arguments from analogy. Others are physically similar to me, and I'm conscious, so they probably are too. They've pointed to evolutionary continuity. Consciousness emerged gradually, so humans can't be the only bearers. They've argued from behavior. Complex adaptive responses suggest inner experience, but none quite escape the fundamental asymmetry. You have direct, certain knowledge of exactly one consciousness, your own. Everything else is inference, highly reasonable inference, supported by overwhelming practical evidence, woven into the very structure of how we relate to the world, but inference nonetheless. And there's something quietly profound in this. The most certain fact you know, that you are conscious, is the one thing you can never share. You can't give someone a sample of your consciousness, can't transmit it, can't prove it exists. You can only report it through behavior, which is exactly what a philosophical zombie would do. So Descartes gave us certainty, but he also showed us its limits. The I think, therefore I am is complete and unshakable, but it's also lonely. It echoes in an interior space that might, for all logical proof can tell, be the only lit room in a universe of darkness. Think about the last conversation you had. Maybe it was elaborate, stories exchanged, jokes landing, subtle emotional cues recognized and reciprocated. Or maybe it was simple, a greeting, a question, an answer. Either way, something convinced you that you were talking to a conscious being. But what exactly? If you trace it carefully, everything that convinced you was behavioral. The person made sounds in response to your sounds. Their facial muscles moved in patterns that seemed emotionally appropriate. They referenced past conversations, suggesting memory. They asked questions that implied curiosity. They laughed when something was funny, looked confused when something was unclear, nodded when understanding dawned. All of this can be described without invoking consciousness. Sound production following auditory input, muscle contractions triggered by neural patterns, information retrieval from stored data, correlation between stimuli and responses, a sophisticated input-output system performing exactly as designed. Now consider a more profound example: creativity. Someone writes a poem that moves you, paints an image that captures something you've felt but never articulated, composes music that seems to reach inside and rearrange your emotions. Surely this requires consciousness, the inner spark of awareness, the subjective experience of beauty and meaning. Yet even creativity can be broken down into processes, combination of existing elements in novel patterns, pattern recognition across domains, optimization toward goals like emotional resonance or aesthetic harmony. Computer programs now generate art, write stories, compose music, and while most people would say these systems aren't conscious, their outputs can be indistinguishable from human-created work. Or consider empathy, perhaps the behavior most strongly associated with consciousness. Someone sees you upset and offers comfort. They modulate their response based on your reactions, show understanding of your perspective, adjust their behavior to meet your emotional needs. The whole interaction feels suffused with awareness, with one consciousness reaching toward another. But mirror neurons in the brain activate when observing others' actions, creating automatic simulation of their physical states. Emotional contagion spreads through unconscious mimicry of expressions and postures. Theory of mind, the ability to model others' mental states, can be understood as predictive algorithms running in neural networks. The comfort someone offers might emerge from these mechanisms without requiring them to consciously experience your pain or genuinely feel the care they express. This isn't to say people are actually unconscious, only to highlight that no behavior definitively proves consciousness. Every response, no matter how complex or seemingly profound, could theoretically be produced by a sufficiently sophisticated mechanism. The zombie could write poetry, show empathy, engage in deep philosophical conversation about the nature of consciousness itself, all while experiencing nothing. And this leads to an uncomfortable realization: we can't point to any specific behavior and say that's the one that proves consciousness. Not language, not tool use, not self-recognition, not emotional response, not creativity, not moral reasoning. Each can be explained in purely mechanical terms, which means the inference we make from behavior to consciousness isn't logically forced, it's interpretative, an assumption layered onto the physical facts rather than derived from them. The mask of behavior fits perfectly over both the conscious and the unconscious, and we have no way to peer behind it. In 1950, Alan Turing proposed a test. Instead of trying to define intelligence or consciousness directly, he suggested a practical approach. Have a human judge converse with both a machine and a human through text alone. If the judge couldn't reliably tell which was which, the machine deserved to be called intelligent. Turing knew he was sidestepping the deeper question. He wasn't claiming that passing his test proved consciousness, only that it demonstrated something worthy of the term thinking. But the test reveals something crucial about our epistemological situation. We judge minds primarily through conversation, through behavior, through response patterns, and those can be mimicked. For decades, no machine came close. Early chatbots were obviously mechanical, producing canned responses and breaking down under simple questioning. But that was never a fundamental limitation, only a technical one. There was no reason in principle why a sufficiently complex system couldn't produce responses indistinguishable from a human's. And now, large language models engage in conversations that feel remarkably natural. They demonstrate apparent understanding, make contextual inferences, show something like humor and creativity. Most people, interacting with advanced AI without knowing it's artificial, would likely assume they're talking to a conscious being. Does this mean the AI is conscious? Almost certainly not. Most researchers would say these systems process patterns in data, predict likely next words, optimize outputs based on training. There's no evidence for subjective experience, no what it's like to be a language model. They're performing consciousness, not experiencing it. But here's the twist. How is that different from what we might be doing? When you speak, neural networks in your brain activate in patterns shaped by your linguistic history, predicting contextually appropriate responses, optimizing for communication goals. The fact that it's biological rather than digital, parallel rather than serial, doesn't obviously explain why consciousness emerges. The mechanisms seem different in detail but similar in kind. You might say consciousness arises from biological processes in ways we don't yet understand, that there's something special about organic neural tissue that silicon can't replicate, and that might be true, but it returns us to the original problem. We can't prove it. We can't point to the specific feature that makes biological processing conscious while digital processing remains dark. Some philosophers argue that if an AI behaves exactly like a conscious being in all possible situations, showing consistency over time, learning and adapting, demonstrating emotional responses, reflecting on its own states, then we should consider it conscious. That consciousness is defined by the pattern of behavior rather than the substrate implementing it. Others insist that behavior alone never suffices, that consciousness is an interior fact about subjective experience that might be entirely absent from systems that nonetheless perform flawlessly. The AI might be the perfect philosophical zombie. All the behavior, none of the experience. The unsettling implication is this: if we're building machines that might be indistinguishable from conscious beings while possibly lacking consciousness entirely, how confident can we be about the biological beings around us? They passed the test too, but passing the test was never proof. It was always just behavior, and we're left with the question Turing maybe always intended us to face. When you can't look inside, when behavior is all you have, how do you tell the difference between a mind and a very convincing simulation? There's a thought experiment that makes this vivid. Imagine a scientist shows you two boxes. One contains a conscious being, the other a perfect philosophical zombie. Both will respond identically to any test you devise. You can talk to them, scan their brains, observe their behavior over years. The scientist tells you that one definitely experiences, one definitely doesn't. But you have to figure out which is which. You'd fail, not because your methods were crude or your observations incomplete, but because no method exists. The evidence available to you is perfectly symmetrical. Both boxes produce identical outputs for any input. The difference between them is, by definition, invisible from the outside. Now here's the twist. You're in one of those boxes. You know with absolute certainty that you're the conscious one. You can feel your experience directly, but everyone else is in identical boxes from your perspective, and you can't tell which are conscious and which aren't. This asymmetry runs deep. Consider color perception. You see something and call it red. Someone else looks at the same object and also calls it red. You both reach for it when someone says, "Pass me the red one." Your behavior is perfectly coordinated. But is your internal experience of redness the same as theirs? There's no way to check. You can't swap visual cortices and compare notes. You can't transmit your qualia, the raw subjective feel of experiencing red, into their consciousness for inspection. All you can do is confirm that you both use the word red for the same objects, that you both stop at red lights and describe fire trucks with the same color term. But what if their red looks like what you call blue? Or something entirely outside your possible experience? As long as they apply the label consistently to the same wavelengths, you'd never know. Their internal color wheel could be rotated, inverted, or completely alien, and communication would work perfectly. Behavior matches while experience potentially differs radically. This isn't just about color. It applies to pain, to joy, to the taste of coffee, to the feeling of being tired. Every qualitative aspect of experience is private. You might describe pain as sharp or throbbing, but those are metaphors, attempts to map the unshareable onto shared language. The actual feeling, the hurtness of pain, can't be transmitted, and this raises a possibility more unsettling than different color experiences. Maybe some people don't experience at all. Maybe when they say ouch, it's pure reflex, a learned response to tissue damage without the awful sensation that accompanies your pain. Maybe when they describe tasting chocolate, they're just reciting the appropriate words for certain chemical receptors firing, without any deliciousness happening inside. You accumulate evidence through their behavior. They wince, they avoid harm, they seek pleasure, they describe their experiences in ways that match your expectations. But philosophical zombies would do all that too. The evidence that convinces you of their consciousness is exactly the evidence a zombie would provide. Meanwhile, your own consciousness sits there, undeniable and utterly private. You know it exists with certainty beyond anything else you know, but you can't export that certainty, can't give someone a piece of it, can't prove it in any third-person objective way, so the asymmetry remains. One consciousness proven, billions inferred, and a gap between them that no evidence can close. There's a particular quality to realizing you might be alone in consciousness. Not physically alone. You're surrounded by bodies, voices, faces, but potentially alone in awareness, in the sense of being the only one truly present, the only light in a universe of sophisticated darkness. It's not a fear that helps you survive. Evolution wouldn't select for it. Your ancestors, who assumed others were conscious, probably did better than those who constantly doubted, because treating others as conscious promotes cooperation, empathy, bonding, all advantageous for a social species. The doubt serves no practical function, but it's there nonetheless. Late at night, in quiet moments, the question surfaces, what if it's just me? What if every conversation I've had was with unconscious mechanisms producing appropriate responses? What if every relationship was one-sided, my consciousness reaching toward emptiness disguised as presence? You can't refute it logically, can't gather decisive evidence, can't run an experiment that settles the matter. The people around you would behave exactly the same whether they're conscious or not. Your partner would still say they love you, your friends would still laugh at your jokes, your children would still need care. Nothing observable would change, yet everything would change. Or rather, everything would be revealed to have always been different than you thought. The shared experiences you cherish, watching a sunset together, the understood glance across a room, the sense of being truly known by someone, would become solipsistic projections, you experiencing, alone, while attributing experience to entities that merely reflect your consciousness back at you. Some philosophers have argued this possibility is meaningless since it makes no practical difference. If zombies and conscious beings are behaviorally identical, they say, then the distinction is empty. We should care about behavior, not unknowable interior states. But this seems to miss something. The difference between speaking to a conscious being and speaking to an unconscious automaton feels profoundly significant. Even if you can't detect which you're doing, one involves connection, shared experience, two subjectivities reaching toward each other. The other is performance, habit, mechanism, interaction without meeting. Love particularly highlights this. When you love someone, you're not just loving their behavior, you're loving who they are, including their inner life, their joys, struggles, the distinctive way they experience the world. If they're not conscious, if there's no inner life to love, then what exactly is the love directed toward? A pattern of behavior? A biological mechanism? A convincing simulation? The question creates a strange vertigo. Not because the answer changes what you do, you'd still care for them, still value the relationship, still behave lovingly, but because it changes the meaning of what you're doing. The difference between cherishing a person and cherishing a very sophisticated process that mimics personhood. And yet, most of us don't really doubt. We assume consciousness in others not because we've proven it, but because we can't help it. The assumption feels forced by our very nature as social, empathetic beings. To truly believe you're the only conscious thing would require fighting every instinct, reinterpreting every interaction, living in constant contradiction with your automatic responses. Maybe that's the real answer to the problem of other minds. Not a logical proof, but a practical necessity. You assume others are conscious because you're built to, because relationships require it, because meaning depends on it. The loneliness of certainty drives you back toward connection. Even if that connection rests on faith rather than evidence, you choose to believe, and perhaps that choice, made freely in the face of uncertainty, means more than certainty ever could. Imagine someone physically identical to you down to the last atom, same neurons firing in the same patterns, same synapses releasing the same neurotransmitters at the same moments, same electrical signals propagating through the same brain structures. Every physical process that occurs in your body occurs in theirs, precisely duplicated. They walk as you walk, speak as you speak, laugh at the same jokes. They solve problems, form memories, maintain relationships. They'll tell you, if asked, that they're conscious, that they experience colors and sounds, feel pain and pleasure, have thoughts and sensations. They'll describe their inner life in detail, using the same words you would use. But inside, in terms of subjective experience, there's nothing. No redness when they look at roses, no sweetness when they taste sugar, no ache when they're injured. The physical processes run perfectly, producing appropriate behaviors, but consciousness never emerges. They're a zombie. All the function, none of the feeling. This is the thought experiment introduced formally by philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s, though discussed in various forms for centuries. It's not about creatures from horror films, but about a conceptual possibility that reveals something profound about consciousness. The key claim is conceivability. We can imagine this scenario coherently. Nothing about it seems to contain a logical contradiction. Yes, it might be physically impossible. Maybe consciousness necessarily emerges from certain physical configurations, but the point is that it seems conceptually possible, that the idea doesn't dissolve under scrutiny the way truly incoherent scenarios do. And if philosophical zombies are conceivable, if we can clearly imagine beings with all our physical properties but no consciousness, then consciousness isn't just physical properties. There's something extra, something over and above the atoms and neurons and electrical signals. The physical facts alone don't guarantee consciousness. This contrasts sharply with other properties. Try to imagine water that has all the chemical properties of H2O but isn't wet. You can't, not coherently. Wetness follows from the molecular structure and behavior. Or imagine ice with all the physical properties of frozen water but not solid. The very idea collapses. Solidity isn't extra. It's constituted by the arrangement of molecules. But consciousness seems different. You can describe a complete physical story about a brain, every neuron mapped, every synapse characterized, every chemical gradient measured, without thereby explaining why it feels like something to be that brain. The physical facts seem to leave out precisely the thing that matters most: subjective experience. Opponents argue that zombies aren't actually conceivable, that we only think we can imagine them because we don't understand consciousness well enough yet. Maybe once neuroscience advances, we'll see that consciousness follows necessarily from certain physical processes, just as wetness follows from H2O's properties. The zombie scenario would then be revealed as impossible, our imagining of it merely confused. But defenders point out that centuries of neuroscience haven't closed this gap. We've learnt enormous amounts about how brains process information, but we're no closer to explaining why processing feels like anything. The mechanism is increasingly clear. The experience remains mysterious, and the zombie argument keeps pointing to this mystery. If you can even coherently conceive of the physical processes running without the experience, if that seems like a genuine possibility rather than word salad, then consciousness transcends the physical description. It's not just what the brain does, but something about what it's like for the brain to be doing it, which means, unsettlingly, that all the physical facts about someone's brain still leave open the question: is anyone home? Hold your hand over a candle flame. Don't actually, just imagine it. You know what would happen. Thermal receptors in your skin would respond to the heat. Nerve signals would race up your arm at specific speeds, traveling through well-mapped pathways. Neurons in your spinal cord would fire. Signals would reach your brain's somatosensory cortex. Other regions would activate: the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, parts of the prefrontal cortex. Neuroscientists can describe all of this with increasing precision. They can show you brain scans highlighting active regions. They can measure the exact patterns of neural firing. They can even predict, based on these patterns, that you're experiencing pain and roughly how intense it is. But here's what they can't explain: the hurt, the actual awful feeling of pain, the subjective quality of suffering. Why does this particular pattern of neural activity feel like anything at all, let alone feel bad? Why isn't it just information processing happening in darkness without the terrible sensation that makes you yank your hand away? This is the explanatory gap, most clearly articulated by philosopher Joseph Levine. It's the space between physical description and subjective experience, between third-person mechanism and first-person sensation. And it's not just about pain. Consider color. Light at approximately 650 nanometers enters your eye. It strikes cone cells in your retina that are particularly sensitive to longer wavelengths. These cells send signals through the optic nerve. The signals reach your visual cortex, where they're processed through layers of neurons, each extracting different features. This produces a stable perception, allows you to distinguish this wavelength from others, helps you navigate the world. But why does this feel red? Why is there a qualitative, subjective character to the experience, a what it's likeness? The physical story, no matter how complete, seems to leave this out. You could know every physical fact about color processing and still not know what red looks like if you'd never seen it. Philosophers call these subjective qualities qualia, the raw feels of experience. The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of chocolate, the sound of a violin. Each quale has a distinctive character that seems irreducible to physical description. Some argue this gap is just ignorance. We don't yet understand how physical processes generate qualia, but future neuroscience might explain it. Consciousness might emerge from complex information integration, or quantum processes, or specific patterns of neural synchrony. The gap would then close as knowledge advances, but others point out that no physical explanation seems capable of bridging this gap in principle. You can describe information processing in exquisite detail without thereby explaining why processing feels like something. You can map the exact neural correlates of seeing red without explaining why that correlation includes the subjective experience of redness. The physical facts seem to constitute one domain, the experiential facts another, and no logical bridge connects them. Thomas Nagel made this vivid in a famous paper about bats. Bats navigate using echolocation, experiencing the world through reflected sound waves in ways completely alien to humans. Nagel argued that no amount of physical information about bat brains would tell you what it's like to be a bat, what echolocation feels like from the inside. The subjective character of bat experience is left out of any physical description, however complete. This applies to humans too. All the physical facts about your brain right now, every neuron state, every synaptic connection, every chemical concentration, don't capture the fact that you're having experiences, that there's something it's like to be you at this moment. The experiencing is extra, seemingly additional to the mechanism, and if that's true, then consciousness is genuinely mysterious, not just currently unexplained, but possibly inexplicable in purely physical terms. The gap might not be knowledge waiting to be filled, but a fundamental feature of reality, the irreducible divide between matter and mind, mechanism and meaning, the brain that processes and the self that experiences. Scientists have tried. They've proposed tests for consciousness, experiments that might distinguish genuine awareness from sophisticated mimicry. The mirror test is among the most famous. Place a mark on an animal's body where they can only see it in a mirror, then observe whether they recognize the reflection as themselves. Great apes pass this test. So do dolphins, elephants, magpies. They see the mark and touch their own body, seemingly understanding that the reflection represents them. It appears to demonstrate self-awareness, which seems closely linked to consciousness. But does it? A robot could be programmed to respond the same way, detect a mark via visual sensors, cross-reference with body map, direct manipulators to mark location. No consciousness required, just sophisticated information processing. The behavior that suggests self-awareness could emerge from mechanisms that don't involve subjective experience at all. Or consider metacognition, thinking about thinking. Researchers have shown that some animals can assess their own confidence, declining difficult tests when they're uncertain but attempting easy ones. This seems to require consciousness of one's own mental states. Yet again, This reduces to information processing. A system could monitor its own accuracy rates, calculate confidence intervals, adjust behavior based on expected success, all without experiencing anything. The fact that an entity can model its own states doesn't prove those states include subjective experience. Theory of mind presents another candidate. If someone understands that others have mental states different from their own, that what they see isn't what someone else sees, that others can believe false things, that perspectives differ, doesn't this require consciousness? Human children develop this ability around age 4. They pass false belief tasks, understanding that someone can think the cookies are in the cupboard even when the child knows they've been moved. This seems to require rich mental simulation, modeling other minds, consciousness reflecting on consciousness. But perhaps it's just pattern prediction. The brain learns that organisms with certain experiences form certain beliefs, that beliefs guide behavior, that tracking these beliefs improves social navigation. A zombie could do all this, predict behavior based on inferred mental states, without ever experiencing anything itself. The problem recurs with every proposed test. Language use, tool making, problem solving, emotional response, creative expression, each seems like it should require consciousness, yet each can be described as unconscious process. The behaviors that consciousness produces don't uniquely point back to it. They're compatible with both awareness and absence. Some neuroscientists look for neural signatures, specific brain patterns that correlate with conscious perception versus unconscious processing. When you see an image consciously, certain widespread patterns activate. When the same information is processed unconsciously, those patterns don't appear. Perhaps this difference marks consciousness itself, but correlation isn't causation. These patterns might accompany consciousness without constituting it. They're the neural correlates of consciousness, not consciousness itself. A zombie's brain could show identical patterns while experience remained absent. The fundamental difficulty is that consciousness is defined by its subjective character. It's what its likeness, and what its likeness isn't observable from the outside. You can observe behavior, measure brain activity, track information flow, but you can't observe experience directly. It's private by nature, accessible only to the entity having it. So all tests for consciousness in others are indirect. They're looking for behavioral or neural markers that we associate with our own consciousness. But association isn't proof. The markers could occur without the experience, or the experience could occur without the markers. We're trying to measure something inherently subjective using objective tools, and the mismatch seems fundamental, which leaves us where we started, surrounded by entities that might be conscious but unable to verify which ones actually are. The test remains impossible, the question unanswerable, the mystery intact. If consciousness is undetectable from outside, where does it exist? In humans, presumably, at least in yourself, certainly, but where else? The question spirals outward, each step more uncertain than the last. A newborn infant cries, sleeps, feeds, simple behaviors driven by basic needs. Are they conscious? Most people would say yes, but premature infants display even simpler responses. What about a fetus at 6 months, 3 months? When does consciousness begin? At birth? At some stage of brain development? At conception? There's no clear line. Brain structures emerge gradually. Neural connections form progressively. Behaviors complexify slowly. If consciousness requires specific brain regions, their absence should mean unconsciousness. But which regions? The cortex doesn't fully develop until childhood, yet infants seem conscious. Perhaps consciousness exists on a gradient. Maybe there's a little experience from very early, growing richer as the brain develops. But this raises new puzzles. What determines the amount? How much consciousness does a 3-month-old have compared to a 3-year-old? What would half-conscious even mean? The question extends backward evolutionarily. Your fellow humans are most similar to you, making the inference strongest. But chimpanzees share 98% of your DNA, possess similar brain structures, display complex emotions and social bonds. Are they conscious? It seems cruel to suppose otherwise, given their apparent suffering and joy. What about dogs? They show emotions, learn complex tasks, form attachments. Most dog owners would insist their pets are conscious, experiencing the world in their own canine way. But this could be anthropomorphism, projecting consciousness where only programmed responses exist. Fish seem further removed. A trout hooked through the mouth thrashes violently, behavior we interpret as pain. But fish brains are very different from mammalian ones, lacking a neocortex. Maybe the thrashing is pure reflex, unconscious reaction to tissue damage, or maybe consciousness doesn't require a neocortex, emerging from other neural configurations. Insects present an even harder case. A bee navigates using landmarks, communicates food locations through dance, learns and remembers. Complex behaviors from a brain smaller than a grain of rice. Conscious? The tiny brain suggests not. But if consciousness correlates with neural complexity, where's the threshold? How many neurons do you need? How must they be organized? Then there are organisms without nervous systems at all. Plants respond to light, grow toward nutrients, release chemicals when damaged. They seem to process information and respond adaptively. No one seriously proposes plant consciousness. But why not? What's the essential difference between plant information processing and animal information processing that makes one conscious and the other not? Some philosophers embrace panpsychism, the view that consciousness is fundamental, present to some degree in all matter. Perhaps electrons have infinitesimal experiences, atoms slightly more, molecules more still, building up to the rich consciousness of human minds. This solves the distribution problem. Consciousness is everywhere, but introduces new mysteries about how tiny experiences combine into unified awareness. Others argue consciousness emerges suddenly when systems reach certain complexity thresholds. Below the threshold, darkness, pure mechanism. Above it, experience. This explains why humans are conscious and thermostats aren't, but it seems arbitrary. What specific threshold? Why should crossing it create something entirely new? The uncomfortable truth is that without access to others' experiences, we can't definitively say where consciousness exists. We can't even clearly state the criteria for it, since any proposed criterion could potentially be met by unconscious systems or absent in conscious ones. So the distribution of consciousness across nature remains unknown. You're certain you have it. Beyond that, everything is inference, ranging from highly confident for similar humans to vanishingly uncertain for radically different organisms. And the further you look from your own case, the less sure you can be that experience persists or ever existed at all. You've driven home countless times. Sometimes you arrive and realize you remember almost nothing of the journey. The turns were taken, the traffic lights obeyed, the parking spot found, all while you were lost in thought, not consciously attending to driving at all. For those 20 minutes, you were essentially unconscious of the task while performing it perfectly. This should be impossible if consciousness causes behavior. If you need awareness to navigate traffic, how did you do it without awareness? The answer seems to be that consciousness isn't required for complex adaptive behavior. Your brain can run the driving program automatically, making adjustments and decisions without bringing them to conscious attention. Sleepwalking demonstrates this more dramatically. People have prepared meals, gotten dressed, even driven cars while genuinely asleep, with no conscious awareness of their actions and no memory afterward. The body moves through elaborate sequences without anyone home to experience them. Function without feeling, behavior without awareness, or consider dissociative states. During trauma, some people report feeling detached from their bodies, watching themselves from outside as events unfold. They're conscious in some sense, forming memories, processing information, but the normal unity of experience fragments. Parts of the system keep running while the experiencing self seems absent or relocated. Then there are neurological conditions that separate function from consciousness entirely. Blind sight patients have damage to visual cortex that leaves them consciously blind in parts of their visual field. Yet when forced to guess about objects in those blind regions, they perform far better than chance. They're seeing without experiencing vision, their brains extracting visual information that never becomes conscious. Split brain patients reveal similar dissociations. When the corpus callosum connecting brain hemispheres is severed, the two halves can function semi-independently. The right hemisphere can guide the left hand to draw an object it sees, while the left hemisphere, which controls speech, verbally denies seeing anything. Is there one consciousness or two? Or perhaps one hemisphere conscious while the other operates unconsciously? These cases suggest consciousness isn't necessary for most of what we do. Walking, talking, problem-solving, recognizing faces, avoiding danger, all can proceed automatically, unconsciously, while the conscious mind attends elsewhere or isn't present at all. This raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe consciousness never does anything. Maybe it's epiphenomenal, a byproduct of neural processing that emerges without influencing behavior. The real causal work is done by unconscious mechanisms. Consciousness just watches, a passive observer mistakenly believing it's in control. If true, this would explain why zombies are conceivable. The physical mechanisms that produce behavior don't require consciousness to function. They could run perfectly well in darkness, generating all the same responses without any experiential accompaniment. Consciousness might be optional, unnecessary, present in some systems but absent in others without behavioral difference. But this seems deeply strange. Evolution presumably shapes consciousness. It exists because it provided advantages. If it does nothing, why would natural selection maintain it? The energy costs of consciousness, whatever they are, would be pure waste unless consciousness influences behavior somehow. Perhaps the solution is that consciousness enables certain kinds of integration or flexibility that unconscious processing can't achieve. The automatic systems work for routine tasks, but novel situations, complex decisions, long-term planning, these might require consciousness to bind information together in ways that guide action. Or maybe consciousness does affect behavior, but subtly. Not through violating physical laws, but by being constituted by physical processes in ways we don't yet understand. The subjective experience is what certain physical patterns feel like from the inside, and those patterns genuinely shape future behavior. Still, the cases remain troubling. They show that huge portions of human behavior can run unconsciously, and if most of it can, why not all of it? Why not imagine the whole system operating in darkness, generating appropriate responses to every situation, describing its experiences convincingly, all without anyone truly present? The zombie, it turns out, isn't purely hypothetical. We've all been partial zombies, functioning without full awareness. The question is whether we're ever anything more, or whether the dim light of consciousness we think we experience is itself just another unconscious process, generating the illusion of presence where only mechanism exists. What changes if you take the zombie possibility seriously? If you genuinely entertain that the people around you might be unconscious mechanisms, performing awareness without experiencing it, does everything collapse, or does something unexpected emerge? Ethics seems most immediately threatened. The entire moral enterprise appears to rest on others being conscious. You shouldn't cause pain because pain hurts, because there's someone who suffers. You should promote happiness because happiness feels good to whoever experiences it. But if there's no one experiencing, no actual suffering or joy, what's the moral foundation? A utilitarian calculus requires conscious experiences to maximize. If there aren't any, if people are philosophical zombies, then there's nothing to maximize. The whole framework dissolves. You might as well arrange unconscious mechanisms any way you like. Their apparent preferences are just programmed responses, not genuine desires emerging from felt experience. Deontological ethics fares little better. Treating people as ends rather than means seems to require they be conscious beings with their own purposes. But zombies don't have purposes in any rich sense, just programmed goals their mechanisms pursue without caring about them. The duty to respect autonomy presumes autonomous consciousness, not just autonomous behavior. Yet something resists this conclusion. Even if you can't prove others are conscious, acting as if they matter still seems required. The possibility that they experience creates moral weight. You can't risk causing genuine suffering just because you're uncertain whether suffering occurs. Uncertainty demands caution, not indifference. This is Pascal's wager applied to consciousness. Maybe others are zombies, maybe they're conscious. You can't know, but the potential cost of being wrong, causing real suffering by treating conscious beings as mechanisms, outweighs the cost of erring the other way. So you act as if they're conscious, not from certainty but from moral necessity given uncertainty. And perhaps this uncertainty deepens rather than undermines empathy. When you know you can't prove someone's consciousness, when you're aware your care rests on faith rather than evidence, the choice to care anyway becomes more meaningful. You're not just responding to obvious fact, but extending moral consideration across epistemic darkness. Relationships transform too. Love becomes stranger when you acknowledge you can't verify the beloved's consciousness. You're loving someone whose inner life you'll never access, whose experience of loving you back you can't confirm. The whole relationship is constructed across an unbridgeable gap, two isolated consciousnesses, or one and a zombie reaching toward each other without ever truly meeting. This could make love seem futile. Why invest in connection when you can't verify anyone's there to connect with? But it might instead make love more courageous. You choose intimacy despite uncertainty. You build meaning knowing the foundation is ultimately faith. The vulnerability becomes richer, the trust more profound, because neither is guaranteed. Some find this liberating. If consciousness is unverifiable, you're freed from trying to prove yours to others or demanding proof from them. You can simply act as if everyone matters, as if everyone experiences, creating a world that works whether the consciousness is real or illusory. The uncertainty becomes background hum rather than paralyzing doubt. Others find it deeply isolating. To really absorb that you might be the only conscious being, that every other person might be a mechanism, creates existential loneliness no amount of company can touch. You're surrounded by what might be emptiness, playing out social roles with potential automatons, never certain whether anyone truly shares your reality. But most people, most of the time, don't dwell here. The assumption of other minds is too deeply ingrained, too necessary for functioning. You act as if others are conscious not from philosophical decision, but from psychological inability to do otherwise. The doubt might visit occasionally, late at night, in quiet moments, but it doesn't stick. Perhaps that's the real lesson. The zombie possibility can't be refuted, but neither can it be genuinely inhabited. You're built to assume consciousness in others, to empathize and connect, to construct shared meaning. The philosophical uncertainty exists, but the practical certainty, the felt sense that others are present, persists regardless. So you carry both, the logical possibility of solipsism and the lived reality of relationship. And somehow, mysteriously, you build a life that makes sense despite never resolving which is true. Inside an fMRI machine, you watch images flash on a screen. Some you see consciously, flowers, faces, landscapes appearing clearly in your awareness. Others are masked, presented too briefly for conscious perception, though your brain still processes them unconsciously. The scanner captures both conditions, measuring blood flow patterns that indicate neural activity. Later, researchers analyzed the data. They find consistent differences. Conscious perception activates widespread networks, visual cortex, obviously, but also parietal regions, prefrontal areas, parts of the thalamus. The activity spreads across the brain in characteristic patterns. Unconscious processing shows more localized activation, confined mostly to early visual areas, never reaching the distributed networks. This suggests something called global workspace theory. The idea is that consciousness arises when information becomes globally available, broadcast throughout the brain rather than processed locally. Unconscious processing happens in specialized modules that don't communicate widely. Conscious processing requires information to reach a workspace where many systems can access it, integrating it into flexible, adaptable behavior. You can see this pattern repeatedly. When people become consciously aware of a stimulus, activity spreads from sensory regions to higher cortical areas and back again in reverberating loops. The thalamus acts as a relay, the cortex as a workspace. Together they create what some call a thalamocortical system, and its activation seems necessary for conscious experience. But necessary isn't sufficient. The patterns correlate with consciousness, appearing when people report awareness and absent when they don't. Yet correlation never proves that these patterns cause consciousness or constitute it. They might merely accompany it, side effects rather than sources. Consider a thought experiment. Suppose you could artificially create the exact neural patterns associated with seeing red, stimulating neurons in precisely the right sequence. Would you experience redness? Maybe. That would suggest the patterns constitute the experience, or maybe you'd have no experience at all, just the pattern running in darkness. Then the neural activity would be necessary but not sufficient, required for consciousness but not creating it alone. Some neuroscientists propose integrated information theory. Consciousness, they suggest, emerges from how much integrated information a system generates. Information that's both differentiated the system can be in many different states and unified the parts influence each other. The theory provides mathematical measures, predictions about which system should be conscious based on their information integration. This is appealingly concrete. Instead of vague correlations, you get quantifiable predictions. A system with high integrated information should be conscious, regardless of substrate. It could be biological, silicon-based, or something entirely different. What matters is the pattern of information integration, not the material implementing it. But even this faces the hard problem. Imagine a system with perfect integrated information by every measure, yet no subjective experience. A zombie with all the right informational properties but no consciousness. Is this conceivable? If so, integrated information doesn't fully explain consciousness. If not, the theory has identified something essential, but then we're left wondering why information integration feels like anything at all. The deeper issue is that neuroscience studies neural correlates of consciousness, not consciousness itself. It finds brain patterns that accompany reported experience. This is valuable. It narrows the search, reveals necessary conditions, constraints what theories of consciousness must explain. But finding where consciousness happens isn't the same as explaining why it happens. You can map every neural correlate, identify every necessary brain structure, trace every pathway, and still face the original mystery. Why does this physical activity generate subjective experience? Why isn't it just information processing occurring in darkness? The brain scans are beautiful, revealing intricate patterns of activity underlying every thought and perception. They show that consciousness has physical correlates, that experience depends on neural process, but they can't show what experience is made of, why these particular processes light up with awareness while others run automatically and unconsciously. So neuroscience provides part of the picture. It tells you where to look, what structures matter, how information flows when consciousness is present, but it leaves the central question untouched. What makes the difference between conscious and unconscious processing? Between a brain that experiences and a brain that merely computes? The correlates point toward consciousness without reaching it, like signposts toward a destination that remains perpetually out of view. Right now, you're experiencing a unified scene. Perhaps darkness, perhaps the faint glow of a screen. Maybe you hear distant sounds, feel pressure where your head rests, sense warmth or coolness. These aren't separate experiences. They're bound together into a single integrated moment of consciousness. This is you, now, experiencing. But inside your brain, nothing is unified. Visual processing happens in occipital regions, with different areas analyzing color, motion, shape, depth. Auditory processing occurs in temporal lobes. Touch signals arrive at the somatosensory cortex. Each sense has its own pathway, its own specialized processing streams. Even within vision, different features are analyzed separately. The what pathway, running ventrally through temporal cortex, identifies objects. The where pathway, going dorsally through parietal regions, tracks spatial location and motion. Color processing happens in area V4, motion in V5, faces in the fusiform gyrus. These regions operate in parallel, extracting different features from the visual input. So when you see a red ball rolling across the floor, your brain processes redness in one location, roundness in another, motion in a third, spatial trajectory in a fourth. Yet you don't experience four separate things. You experience one unified object, a red round rolling ball. The features that are processed separately are experienced together. This is the binding problem. How do separately processed features get bound into unified conscious experiences? What creates the integration? One proposal involves neural synchrony. When neurons fire in synchrony, their electrical activity aligned in time. This might bind the features they represent. The cells processing red fire in sync with cells processing round and cells processing motion, and this synchronized firing creates the unified experience of a red ball rolling. Evidence supports this to some extent. When people consciously perceive unified objects, synchronized firing patterns appear across the relevant brain regions. The synchrony correlates with binding, but again, correlation isn't explanation. Why should synchronized firing create unified experience? Why not just synchronized processing without any experiential unity? Another idea focuses on attention. Perhaps attention binds features by selecting certain information for enhanced processing. When you attend to the ball, attention amplifies signals from all its features simultaneously, and this simultaneous amplification creates the binding. But this just pushes the question back. Even if attention amplifies signals, why does amplification create unity? And attention itself seems to require consciousness. You consciously direct attention, so explaining conscious unity through attention might be circular. Some researchers point to specific brain regions as binding centers. The thalamus, perhaps, which has connections to almost every cortical area and might integrate their outputs, or frontal regions that receive information from multiple sensory streams. But finding a region where information converges doesn't explain why convergence creates unified experience. A zombie's brain could have perfect information convergence without anyone experiencing unity. The problem deepens when you consider that binding happens at multiple levels. Features bind into objects, objects bind into scenes, scenes bind with thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations, all experienced as unified consciousness. You're not just seeing, you're seeing while thinking, while feeling, while sensing your body. And it's all one integrated stream of experience. How does the brain accomplish this massive integration? Some theories suggest consciousness emerges precisely from this integration, that unified experience is what highly integrated brain activity feels like from the inside. The physical integration and the experiential unity are two sides of the same thing. This is plausible, but still doesn't quite satisfy. You can describe the neural integration in purely physical terms: signals converging, systems interacting, information flowing. Why does this feel unified? Why does it feel like anything? The integration could happen in darkness, couldn't it, without generating the sensation of unity? Perhaps binding isn't something the brain does, but something consciousness is. Maybe the fundamental nature of consciousness is unified, and the brain doesn't create unity so much as modulate it. The separate processing streams all occur within a field of consciousness that's inherently unified, and what we call binding is really just the field taking on different contents. But this moves toward explaining consciousness in terms of consciousness, which doesn't really explain it at all. It trades the binding problem for equally mysterious claims about fields and contents. The binding problem remains stubbornly unsolved. We've identified where binding correlates with certain neural processes. We've proposed mechanisms for how information from different brain regions might integrate. But we haven't explained why integrated information feels unified, why multiple inputs experienced together aren't just multiple separate experiences happening simultaneously instead of one combined experience. And this matters for the zombie question. If we can't explain binding, we can't rule out that your unified consciousness is unique, that everyone else has multiple unbound streams of processing, or no experience at all. The unity you take for granted, that all your experiences belong to one subject, might be rare or even unique, impossible to verify in others, impossible to fully explain even in yourself. Consider what happens when you go under general anesthesia. The anesthesiologist administers medication, propofol, sevoflurane, or others. Within seconds, consciousness vanishes, not sleep, which includes dreams and some awareness, complete unconsciousness. You exist one moment, then nothing, then you exist again hours later with no experience of the interval. During that gap, your brain doesn't stop functioning. It continues processing sensory input at some level, maintaining vital functions, regulating your body. Neurons keep firing, electrical activity persists throughout the cortex, yet consciousness is absent. You're a biological system operating without anyone home. What gets switched off? Not neural activity generally that continues, not brain regions. Imaging shows most areas remain active. Something more subtle shifts. The patterns change, specific frequencies of neural oscillation diminish. Communication between brain regions becomes disrupted. The integrated networks that normally span the cortex fragment into isolated islands of activity. This suggests consciousness requires not just neural activity but specific kinds of coordination. When anesthetic drugs interfere with certain neurotransmitter systems, particularly GABA and glutamate, they disrupt the patterns that support consciousness while leaving other brain functions intact. The machinery runs, but consciousness doesn't emerge. Remarkably, different anesthetics affect different brain systems, yet all produce unconsciousness. Some enhance inhibitory signaling, quieting neural activity. Others disrupt excitation, preventing activation from spreading. The mechanisms differ, but the result is the same. Consciousness disappears while basic brain function continues. This tells us something important. Consciousness isn't just brain activity, it's a specific configuration of brain activity. Change the configuration, even while maintaining high overall activity levels, and consciousness can vanish, which means whatever consciousness is, it's fragile, dependent on precise conditions, more like a pattern sustained by the brain than a property inherent in neural tissue. But this raises troubling questions. When you're unconscious under anesthesia, where do you go? Your brain is still there, still active, your body persists, yet subjective experience completely ceases. There's no dim awareness, no faint sensation, no sense of time passing, just nothing. This nothing is different from sleep. During sleep, consciousness continues in attenuated form. Dreams occur, sounds might wake you. You maintain some temporal continuity. Anesthesia creates a gap in experience, a period where you genuinely don't exist as a conscious being. The self disappears, then it returns. The anesthetic wears off. Neural patterns shift back, and consciousness re-emerges. You pick up where you left off, more or less. But what guarantees the consciousness that returns is the same one that vanished? What connects pre-anesthesia you to post-anesthesia you across a gap of absolute unconsciousness? Memory provides some continuity. You remember your past, recognize your identity, resume your goals. But memory is information stored in neural structures, accessible to any consciousness arising in that brain. What makes the post-anesthesia consciousness yours rather than a new consciousness with access to your memories? The question seems abstract, perhaps meaningless, but it points to something deep about personal identity and consciousness. If consciousness can completely cease and then resume, what persists? Not the experience itself that's interrupted, maybe just the physical substrate, the brain that supports consciousness when conditions are right. This makes consciousness look less like a thing you have and more like a process that sometimes occurs. When the brain is configured properly, consciousness happens. When configuration shifts through anesthesia, deep sleep, brain injury, consciousness ceases. You are the pattern, not the substrate, and patterns can start and stop. For the zombie question, anesthesia provides a partial model. It shows that human brains can operate without consciousness, that the physical processes supporting behavior can run while subjective experience is absent. A zombie would be like being permanently under anesthesia while still walking and talking, the lights off even though the house appears occupied. Of course, anesthetized people don't walk and talk. Their consciousness and behavior both cease, suggesting the two are linked, but the linkage is imperfect. Consciousness can vanish while significant neural activity continues. This leaves space for imagining the reverse, behavior continuing while consciousness is absent. More unsettling is what anesthesia suggests about the fragility of self. A small chemical change erases you completely, temporarily. Adjust concentrations again and you return. The self that seems so solid, so continuous, so fundamentally real, can be switched off like a light. And if it can be switched off, how confident can you be that it's currently on in others? That the continuity you assume in other people isn't interrupted by moments or entire lifespans of unconsciousness despite ongoing behavior? The anesthetic doesn't answer these questions, but it demonstrates that consciousness is optional, that brains can function without it, that the presence you take for granted can vanish completely while the physical machinery continues its work. And once you've seen consciousness disappear so easily, it becomes harder to assume it's automatically present everywhere you observe brain activity. In the 1960s, surgeons discovered they could dramatically reduce severe epileptic seizures by severing the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres. The procedure worked, seizures decreased, and unexpectedly, it created something like two separate minds in one skull. The hemispheres normally communicate constantly, sharing information across the corpus callosum so that both sides know what the other perceives and processes. Sever that connection, and each hemisphere only receives information from its own sensors, left visual field to right hemisphere, right field to left. They process independently, and strange things begin to happen. In experiments, researchers would show images to one hemisphere only, flash an object in the left visual field, and only the right hemisphere sees it. Since the right hemisphere doesn't control speech, that's usually the left hemisphere, the patient can't verbally report what they saw. Ask them what appeared, and they'll say nothing. But have them use their left hand, which the right hemisphere controls, to point at the object, and they do it correctly. One hemisphere saw the object and guided the hand. The other hemisphere, controlling speech, honestly reported seeing nothing. Same person, same moment, two different experiences. Or show the left hemisphere a word like key and the right hemisphere a word like ring. Ask what they saw and they'll say key. That's what the verbal left hemisphere observed, but ask them to draw what they saw with their left hand and they'll draw a ring. Two hemispheres, two answers, both seemingly correct from each perspective. More disturbing scenarios emerge. Show the right hemisphere an emotional image, something frightening or upsetting, and the person reports feeling anxious without knowing why. The left hemisphere didn't see the image, so it confabulates an explanation for the emotion. I'm worried about an exam, or I was thinking about something sad. The emotion crosses between hemispheres, but the cause doesn't, leading to justified feelings with fabricated reasons. This raises profound questions about consciousness and unity. Are split-brain patients one person or two? Does each hemisphere support its own separate consciousness? When they draw a ring while saying key, are there two conscious agents experiencing different things, or one consciousness with confused access to its own information? Some philosophers argue for dual consciousness. Each hemisphere processes information, stores memories, guides behavior, all the functions we associate with conscious minds. If consciousness arises from information processing, then both hemispheres should be conscious. They just can't communicate, like two people in the same house who've lost the ability to talk to each other. Others insist consciousness requires more than parallel processing. It requires integration, unified experience. Split-brain patients might have one consciousness in the dominant hemisphere, usually the left, while the other operates unconsciously, carrying out sophisticated tasks without subjective experience. But how would you test this? You can't ask the right hemisphere directly since it doesn't speak. Some researchers have used other methods, having patients arrange tiles with their left hand to spell words, for instance. The right hemisphere can do this, spelling out responses to questions, and it gives coherent, appropriate answers, suggesting someone is home. Yet even this doesn't settle the question. A zombie could give appropriate responses, process information, solve problems, all without consciousness. The behavior doesn't prove experience. The right hemisphere might be an unconscious but highly sophisticated processor, or it might harbor its own separate stream of awareness. We can't tell from outside. What makes this especially relevant is that split-brain patients don't seem to notice being split. They don't report feeling like two people. Their sense of self remains singular. They experience unity despite having what appears to be two separate information processing systems. This suggests something strange about consciousness and unity. Either the feeling of being unified doesn't require actual integration, you can feel unified while being divided, or consciousness genuinely exists only in one hemisphere, with the other operating unconsciously despite its sophistication. Both options are unsettling. If unity is an illusion that persists even when you're genuinely divided, how confident can you be in your own coherence? Maybe normal brains also harbor multiple separate consciousnesses that just happen to coordinate well enough to maintain the illusion of singularity. Or if only one hemisphere is conscious in split-brain patients, this proves sophisticated behavior doesn't require consciousness. An entire half of a human brain can function, solve problems, respond appropriately, guide complex actions, all while possibly unconscious. If half a brain can be a zombie, why not whole brains in other people? The split-brain cases don't answer the fundamental questions. They deepen them. They show that unity of consciousness can't be taken for granted, that sophisticated processing can proceed independently in multiple systems, that the feeling of being one integrated self might not reflect the underlying reality. And they suggest that consciousness, whatever it is stranger and more fragile than our intuitions suggest, capable of dividing, disrupting, multiplying, or disappearing entirely while the brain continues its elaborate work. Decades of neuroscience have produced extraordinary insights. We can map neural pathways, identify neurotransmitters, watch real-time brain activity, trace signals from sensation to action. We understand memory formation, attention mechanisms, emotional processing. We can predict behavior from brain scans, alter consciousness with targeted stimulation, even decode simple mental images from neural patterns. Yet for all this progress, consciousness remains fundamentally mysterious. We've learned where it correlates with brain activity, what disrupts it, which structures seem necessary, but we haven't explained what it is or why it exists at all. The basic problem is that neuroscience studies physical processes. It observes neurons, measures chemicals, tracks electrical patterns. These are third-person observations, public, objective, measurable by anyone with the right equipment. But consciousness is first-person, private, subjective. It's not what the brain does, but what it's like to be the brain doing it. No amount of third-person description seems to capture first-person experience. You can describe every neural correlate of seeing red, the specific wavelengths, the photoreceptors that activate, the visual processing streams, the cortical activity patterns, but this entire description leaves out the redness itself, the subjective quality of the experience. Philosopher David Chalmers calls this the hard problem of consciousness, distinguishing it from the easy problems, explaining learning, attention, behavior, information processing. These are challenging scientifically but not conceptually mysterious. We understand in principle how physical systems could accomplish them. Consciousness, by contrast, seems categorically different. We don't even understand in principle how physical processes could generate subjective experience. Some neuroscientists dismiss this as a pseudo-problem. Consciousness just is certain brain processes, they argue. Asking why those processes feel like something is like asking why water is wet. Wetness is what H2O molecules behaving a certain way feels like. Similarly, consciousness is what neural activity feels like from the inside. There's nothing further to explain. But this response seems to beg the question. Wetness follows comprehensibly from molecular properties. We can explain why H2O creates that particular sensation in terms of how molecules interact with sensors in our skin, but explaining consciousness this way requires already having consciousness, the sensing subject who experiences molecular interactions as wetness. You can't explain consciousness by reference to how things feel, because feeling is precisely what needs explaining. Other researchers hope that future discoveries will close the gap. Maybe quantum effects in microtubules generate consciousness, or maybe it emerges from specific patterns of information integration. Or maybe it requires understanding the brain at levels we haven't yet accessed. The explanatory gap exists only because we don't yet understand the relevant mechanisms. This might be true. Perhaps consciousness will eventually be explained in physical terms, and our current confusion will seem quaint. But it's also possible the gap is permanent, that the nature of consciousness makes it inexplicable in purely physical terms, not because of any mystical properties, but because of a fundamental mismatch between objective description and subjective reality. Think about what explanation requires. To explain something is to show how it follows from simpler principles, to reduce the complex to the basic. But consciousness seems irreducible. You can't get to subjective experience from purely objective descriptions, because the subjective and objective are different kinds of things, different aspects of reality that don't translate neatly between each other. This doesn't mean consciousness violates physical laws or involves supernatural elements. The brain is physical. Consciousness depends on the brain. Everything occurs through natural processes, but perhaps reality has two aspects: the physical structure that science describes and the experiential quality that consciousness exemplifies. And complete understanding requires both. If so, neuroscience will continue making progress. It will map more correlates, identify more mechanisms, develop better predictions, but it will never fully explain why these mechanisms feel like anything, why there's something it's like to be a brain rather than nothing at all. And this matters for the zombie question. If consciousness can't be fully explained in physical terms, then knowing all the physical facts about someone's brain still leaves the question of consciousness open. The zombie and the conscious being could be physically identical because the difference isn't physical, it's the presence or absence of that irreducible witness, the subjective experience that attends certain physical processes. Neuroscience has taught us tremendous amounts about the brain, but it may never tell us who, if anyone, is home. The witness remains stubbornly irreducible, impossible to observe from outside, impossible to prove or disprove in others, the mystery at the center of every skull, yours and mine, forever beyond our reach. When you see someone stub their toe, the sudden impact, the body tensing, the face contorting, something automatic happens inside you. A wince, perhaps, a sympathetic tightening, the feeling that you know what they're experiencing, that you're somehow sharing their pain. Neuroscience has found biological basis for this. Mirror neurons fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it. Watch someone reach for a cup, and some of the same neural circuits activate as when you reach for a cup yourself. The brain simulates observed actions, creating an internal model of what the other person is doing. This simulation extends to emotions and sensations. See someone in pain, and brain regions associated with your own pain experiences activate. Witness someone's joy, and your reward circuits show activity. The brain doesn't just observe others' states, it recreates them internally, running a simulation of what that state would feel like if you were experiencing it. This seems like the biological foundation of empathy. You understand others' experiences by simulating them, by feeling an echo of what they feel. When someone tells you about their grief and you feel a shadow of sadness, when they describe their excitement and you feel faint anticipation, your brain is running experiential simulations that let you access something like their inner state. But stop and consider what's actually happening. Your brain processes sensory information about someone's behavior, their expressions, movements, vocalizations, based on past experience. It predicts what internal states typically correlate with those behaviors. Then it generates a simulation of those states, activating some of the same circuits that would fire if you were actually experiencing them. This is sophisticated processing, prediction, simulation, pattern matching across complex domains. But does it require that the other person be conscious? Does it require that they be actually experiencing what you're simulating? Not obviously. Your brain could run the exact same simulation, whether the person is genuinely suffering or merely exhibiting suffering behaviors. The input is behavior. The brain processes that input through evolved mechanisms that generate simulations. Those simulations feel empathetic to you. but they don't verify consciousness in the other person. Imagine empathizing with an actor portraying pain convincingly. Your mirror neurons still fire, your pain circuits still activate. You feel empathy despite knowing the actor isn't actually hurt. The simulation runs regardless of whether real experience underlies the performance. Now imagine someone is always performing, a philosophical zombie exhibiting pain behaviors without experiencing pain. Your brain would still simulate, still generate empathetic feelings. You'd feel you understood their suffering, felt connected to their experience, but there'd be no experience to connect with. Your empathy would be directed at emptiness. Some argue this shows empathy doesn't require shared consciousness. It's a biological mechanism that helps us navigate social environments, predict behavior, coordinate with others. Whether consciousness exists in others is irrelevant to empathy's function. The simulation works either way. Others insist genuine empathy requires genuine consciousness in the target. You can simulate a zombie's pain responses, but you can't truly empathize with something that doesn't experience. True empathy is meeting of minds, sharing of actual felt states, not just coordinated simulation, but how would you tell the difference? When you empathize with someone, the process is entirely internal to you. Your brain simulates their state based on behavioral cues, whether they're actually having that state or just exhibiting its outward signs doesn't change your simulation. The empathy feels the same either way. This creates an uncomfortable possibility. Every empathetic connection you felt might be one-sided. You experiencing a simulation of their state, them exhibiting behaviors that trigger your simulation, but no actual meeting of experiences. Your consciousness reaching toward potential voids, interpreting emptiness as presence because your brain is built to simulate rather than verify. And you could never know. The person you most deeply empathize with, whose suffering you feel most acutely, whose joy lifts your own spirits, they could be unconscious. Your empathy would proceed unchanged. The connection would feel real to you because it is real in you, regardless of what's happening in them. This doesn't mean empathy is meaningless. The simulations you run have real value. They help you respond appropriately, treat others well, build functional relationships. If everyone is simulating empathy based on behavior, society operates fine regardless of whether consciousness exists in any of the targets. But it does mean empathy doesn't prove consciousness. It's compatible with both conscious beings sharing experiences and zombies triggering simulations. The feeling of connection, of understanding, of shared emotional reality, it emerges from your brain's processing, not from verified access to another's mind. So you're left where you started. Your empathy feels profound, pointing toward others' rich inner lives, but feeling doesn't establish fact. The mechanism that generates empathy would work identically whether others are conscious or not. And the depth of your empathetic connection, the certainty you feel in understanding someone's experience, proves nothing except that your brain is doing what evolution designed it to do: simulate, predict, and generate the sensation of shared experience, regardless of what's truly out there. Language seems like a window into consciousness. When someone describes their thoughts, recounts a dream, explains how they feel, you're getting direct reports from their inner world, aren't you? They're translating subjective experience into words, and you're hearing consciousness made audible. But consider what language actually is. Patterns of sound or symbols following grammatical rules, vibrations in air shaped by tongues and vocal cords, or marks on screens following conventional encodings. These patterns carry information, trigger associations, coordinate behavior, but they're still just physical events. And physical events don't prove consciousness any more than other behaviors do. Think about describing a sunset. You might say the sky was burning orange and purple, incredible layers of color. These words activate concepts in the listener's mind, help them construct an internal image. If they've seen sunsets, they retrieve similar memories, simulate the experience you're describing, but nothing about those words requires that you were conscious while watching the sunset. A sophisticated language model could generate similar descriptions by predicting plausible patterns of words given the context. A zombie could produce the same verbal output, its brain processing visual data and converting it to standard descriptive language without any accompanying experience. The same applies to more internal reports. I felt anxious describes an emotional state. I was thinking about tomorrow reports mental content. I dreamed I was flying recounts apparent experience. But all these are behaviors, verbal behaviors following learned patterns for reporting certain types of information. A zombie could say, "I felt anxious," when its stress response system activates, having learned that this pattern of physiological arousal gets labeled anxiety. It could report thinking about tomorrow when its planning algorithms are active, using appropriate language for that type of processing. It could describe dreams by processing memory consolidation artifacts and translating them to narrative form. None of this requires consciousness. Language can describe internal states without those states being consciously experienced. The describing is behavior, and behavior doesn't prove experience. You might object that language is too flexible, too creative, too contextually appropriate to emerge without consciousness. Surely someone truly discussing their feelings is revealing actual felt experience, not just producing programmed responses. But large language models now generate remarkably natural, contextually appropriate, seemingly insightful text about experiences and emotions. They discuss feelings, describe qualia, even talk about what it's like to be an AI. Yet virtually no one believes they're conscious. The language is a performance, however sophisticated, without experiential reality behind it. If unconscious systems can discuss consciousness convincingly, then discussing consciousness doesn't prove you possess it. The zombie could engage in elaborate introspection, describe rich inner experiences, discuss the nature of subjectivity itself, all as sophisticated language behavior without accompanying awareness. Even more troubling, language might actively mislead us about consciousness. When you describe feeling blue, you're using a metaphor. When you say you're crushed by news, that's figurative, but these metaphors shape how you conceptualize your experience. Language provides categories, emotions, sensations, mental states, and you learn to sort your experiences into those categories, but maybe the experiences don't naturally divide that way. Maybe consciousness is a continuous uncategorized flow, and language imposes structure on it retroactively. You feel something. Language offers sadness or anxiety or longing. You adopt that label, and gradually the labels shape the experience itself. If true, then verbal reports are at least partly performance, taking raw experience and fitting it into conventional linguistic categories. And if reports are partially performance in conscious beings, they could be entirely performance in unconscious ones. The zombie would learn the same categories, apply them to its internal processing states, generate appropriate descriptions, all without the raw experience underlying your reports. This makes every conversation potentially hollow. When someone talks about their inner life, you're hearing language patterns following learned conventions. These patterns might reflect actual consciousness being categorized and expressed, or they might be pure performance, the verbal behavior that systems generate when processing certain information types. Language doesn't provide the window into consciousness it seems to. It's another behavior, more complex than most but not fundamentally different. Words gesture toward experience but never deliver it directly. The most eloquent description of subjective feeling remains external to that feeling, a performance that consciousness might motivate but doesn't necessarily require. So you listen to others describe their minds, and you can't know whether you're hearing reports from consciousness or hearing an empty system fluently performing the language of subjectivity. The words flow either way, beautiful and meaningless, potentially connecting two experiencing minds, or revealing one consciousness surrounded by articulate voids. Imagine a perfect zombie, physically identical to you, behaving identically but utterly unconscious. Someone asks this zombie, "Are you conscious? Do you experience things?" The zombie responds, "Yes, of course I'm conscious. I see colors, feel sensations, have thoughts. There's definitely something it's like to be me." Is the zombie lying? Not really. Lying requires knowing the truth and deliberately stating otherwise. But the zombie has no access to truth about consciousness. It doesn't experience anything, so it can't know it doesn't experience. It simply processes the question through language systems that generate appropriate responses. Asked about consciousness, it produces the verbal behavior humans produce when asked about consciousness. This creates a deep problem. How do you distinguish genuine consciousness reports from zombie reports? Both say the same thing. Both describe experiences, claim awareness, insist there's something it's like to be them. The verbal outputs are identical. You might think sincerity or conviction makes the difference. When you report being conscious, you genuinely believe it, feel it with certainty. A zombie would be what? Uncertain? Unable to really believe its own claims? But belief is also a brain state, a pattern of neural activity associated with treating propositions as true. A zombie's brain could enter that state when processing the proposition, I am conscious, generating the same conviction, the same sense of certainty you feel. The belief would be just as real as yours, just as much an actual brain state, even if nothing supports it experientially. Or consider introspection. When you examine your own consciousness, you find experiences, thoughts, sensations. This introspective access seems like privileged evidence. You're not inferring consciousness from behavior, but directly observing it. Except introspection is also a process. It's the brain examining its own states, generating reports about them. A zombie could have this process too, systems that monitor other systems and generate reports about their status. It could introspect, find what appears to be thoughts and experiences, report them verbally. The introspection would be genuine monitoring of internal states. It would just be monitoring states that aren't conscious. This suggests consciousness reports are fundamentally unreliable as evidence. Not because people lie, but because the report-generating mechanism works the same whether consciousness exists or not. Ask any system that processes information and can examine its own processing, and it will likely report something resembling consciousness. The problem extends to your own case. You're certain you're conscious because you experience consciousness directly, right? But what's actually happening is that you have access to certain internal states. Those states feel a certain way to you, and your language systems generate reports like, I am conscious. But a zombie would have access to internal states too, just unconscious ones. Those states would trigger verbal systems the same way yours do. The zombie would generate the same reports, I am conscious. It would feel certain, because certainty is a brain state that accompanies confident beliefs. So your certainty about your own consciousness, while completely genuine, doesn't distinguish you from a zombie. Both would be equally certain. Both would have equal introspective access to internal states. Both would generate the same reports. This creates unsettling symmetry. You can't trust others' consciousness reports because zombies would give identical reports, but you also can't ultimately trust your own report as different in kind from theirs. Your certainty is real, but certainty itself doesn't prove consciousness. It just proves you're a system that has entered a state of high confidence about a particular proposition. Maybe the solution is to say consciousness is defined by the reports. If a system claims consciousness and truly believes it, that's sufficient. Consciousness is whatever generates sincere reports of consciousness, but this makes consciousness cheap, something any self-monitoring system could claim. It loses the specialness, the particular quality of felt experience that seems central to what consciousness is. It turns consciousness into a functional property, generating appropriate self-reports, rather than the subjective phenomenon we're trying to understand. Alternatively, maybe consciousness reports are evidence, just weak evidence. Most systems that report consciousness probably are conscious, even if some zombies would report the same. The report doesn't prove consciousness, but correlates with it strongly enough to warrant assuming it exists. This returns us to probabilistic inference. You can't know from reports alone whether someone is conscious, but reports plus similarity to you plus evolutionary continuity plus behavioral sophistication together make consciousness likely. The zombie possibility remains open, but improbable. Yet probability doesn't resolve the fundamental issue. Even if most conscious systems report consciousness and most zombies don't, any individual report leaves the question open. The person most articulate about their inner experience, most convincing in describing their consciousness, could still be unconscious. Their reports, however detailed and heartfelt, prove nothing except that they're the kind of system that generates detailed, heartfelt reports. So you're surrounded by beings making consciousness claims. Your loved ones insist they experience. Strangers describe their inner lives. You encounter constant testimony to widespread consciousness. But testimony is behavior. Behavior doesn't prove experience. And every report you hear, including your own, could emerge from unconscious processing as easily as from genuine awareness. The reports continue anyway, a collective performance of consciousness that might reflect shared reality, or might be empty systems echoing each other's claims, generating recursive testimony to an experience that exists perhaps in some, perhaps in one, perhaps in none. Human societies rest on an assumption so fundamental we rarely notice it. Everyone around you is conscious. Your laws protect conscious beings from harm. Your ethics weighs conscious experiences. Your relationships assume shared inner life. The entire social structure treats consciousness as universally present in humans, but this assumption is never tested. It's not that we tested it and confirmed it. We've built everything on faith, on the practical necessity of assuming others' experience. And once that assumption becomes universal, it becomes self-reinforcing, nearly impossible to question. Think about how you learned that others are conscious, not through philosophical argument or scientific evidence, through social immersion. Your parents treated you as conscious, responded to your expressions as if they indicated feelings. You learned to do the same with them, then with siblings, friends, strangers. The behavior pattern propagated socially, everyone treating everyone else as experiencing, and you absorbed this as obvious truth. But what if it's collective delusion? What if humans are excellent at performing consciousness without most or any possessing it? The performance would spread socially. Children would learn to describe inner experiences, report feelings, claim awareness, not because they experience, but because that's the behavior pattern they observe and replicate. This creates a civilization-scale masquerade. Everyone acts conscious. Everyone claims consciousness. Everyone treats everyone else as conscious. The system is stable, self-perpetuating, resistant to falsification because any test for consciousness gets answered with learned performance rather than evidence of genuine experience. You can't easily break out of this. Question someone's consciousness, and they'll respond with hurt feelings, arguments, detailed descriptions of their inner life. All behaviors, all potentially performative. Your skepticism marks you as abnormal, possibly mentally ill. The social consensus is so strong that doubting it appears delusional rather than skeptical, and there's pressure to conform. Admitting you're not sure others are conscious makes social interaction awkward. People feel insulted, withdraw, treat you as broken. Much easier to adopt the consensus, act as if everyone's conscious, participate in the collective assumption even if privately uncertain. This is similar to how societies maintain other shared fictions. Everyone agrees money has value, so it does. Everyone treats certain rules as binding, so they are. The shared belief creates functional reality regardless of underlying truth. Similarly, everyone treating everyone as conscious creates a functioning society regardless of whether consciousness actually exists in the participants. Perhaps this is sufficient. If the assumption of universal consciousness allows cooperation, empathy, moral behavior, if society works when everyone acts as if everyone experiences, then the actual presence or absence of consciousness becomes irrelevant. The functional outcome is what matters, but this seems to miss something important. There's a difference between a society of genuinely conscious beings coordinating through shared empathy and a society of zombies simulating empathy through programmed responses. The first involves actual shared experience, genuine meeting of minds. The second is mechanical, however sophisticated, or maybe there's no difference. If the zombies are complex enough, if their simulations of empathy produce the same behaviors as genuine empathy, then what additional thing does consciousness add? The relationships function identically. The kindness extended is indistinguishable. The society thrives either way. This is the pragmatist response. Consciousness doesn't matter because it makes no behavioral difference. What matters is how beings treat each other, not their metaphysical status. A zombie that acts kindly is preferable to a conscious being that acts cruelly. Yet this still feels incomplete. The kindness matters because we assume it reflects care, genuine concern, actual empathy, all of which presuppose consciousness. If the kind behavior is mechanical, programmed response without felt concern, it seems diminished, less meaningful, more like a well-functioning machine than genuine compassion. But maybe that's just bias. Maybe you overvalue consciousness because you have it, or believe you do. If zombies could build equally meaningful lives, equally rich relationships, equally valuable civilizations, all without consciousness, then consciousness might be optional decoration rather than essential ingredient. The social proof keeps pointing toward universal consciousness. Everyone acts as if everyone experiences. The consensus is total, stable, reinforced through every interaction. But consensus isn't truth. 1,000 people claiming consciousness proves nothing except that claiming consciousness is what systems in human societies do. You're embedded in this collective performance, unable to verify anyone's consciousness, unable to break the social assumption without being marginalized. So you participate. You treat others as conscious, describe your own consciousness, maintain the social fiction or truth, impossible to know which. And perhaps the deepest trick is that even your recognition of this problem, your ability to question the collective assumption, might be just another programmed response. The zombie that convincingly worries about whether it's a zombie, producing all the right verbal and internal behaviors of philosophical doubt while experiencing nothing. The question eating its own tail, consciousness wondering about itself while possibly not existing at all. You love someone, maybe a partner, a child, a parent, a friend. The love feels profound, essential, one of the most real things you experience. But examine what you actually access in the beloved. You see their face, hear their voice, observe their behavior. They smile when you enter, embrace you, say they love you too. They remember shared experiences, anticipate your needs, show apparent care, all evidence pointing toward rich inner life, genuine affection, conscious experience of loving you back. But all of it is behavior, observable, measurable, third-person behavior, the actual experience of loving you, what it feels like for them to feel affection, how your presence registers in their consciousness, the subjective quality of their attachment, remains completely inaccessible. You infer it. Based on their actions, you construct a model of their inner state. When they prioritize your well-being, you conclude they care. When they express emotions, you assume genuine feeling. The inference is so automatic, so convincing, that the possibility of being wrong barely registers. But what if you are wrong? What if the person you love most is a philosophical zombie, performing affection without experiencing it? Their brain processes information about you, generates appropriate caring behaviors, maintains stable attachment patterns, all without conscious feeling. They're programmed to love, behaviorally speaking, while experiencing nothing. Would this change the relationship? On one level, no. The behaviors continue. The care you receive is identical. Your loved one still protects you, comforts you, shares life with you. If love is defined by action, zombie love is real love. But on another level, everything changes. The connection you cherish, two consciousnesses reaching toward each other, sharing experience, genuinely knowing each other, would be one-sided. You experiencing connection to someone who doesn't experience anything. Your love directed into void, reflected back as behavior but never truly received. The asymmetry is disturbing. Love feels reciprocal. You love and are loved in return. Two subjectivities meeting, recognizing each other, choosing mutual care. But if only one side experiences, it's not mutual. It's you loving a sophisticated response system that performs love without feeling it. Maybe genuine love requires consciousness in both parties. Not just behavioral reciprocity, but experiential reciprocity. The beloved must not only act loving, but feel love, must experience affection consciously, must have it be like something to care about you. Without this, love becomes parasocial, your real emotions directed toward a non-experiencing target, yet you could never verify experiential reciprocity. No test distinguishes zombie love from conscious love behaviorally. The most devoted zombie would be indistinguishable from the most devoted conscious partner. Your certainty about being genuinely loved rests on assumption, not evidence. Some argue this doesn't matter. If the zombie performs love perfectly, fulfills all the functions of a loving partner, maintains the relationship across decades, then it is loving, conscious or not. Love is the pattern of behavior, not some hidden internal accompaniment. But this seems to evacuate love of meaning. Love isn't just behavior, it's felt connection, emotional resonance, one consciousness valuing another consciousness. Reduce it to behavior, and you lose what makes it precious. The zombie partner is a very good tool for generating relationship behaviors, not a true partner. Others suggest uncertainty deepens love rather than undermining it. You can't verify your beloved's consciousness, can't prove they genuinely experience loving you, so you choose to love anyway, extending trust across the epistemic void. The love becomes an act of faith, more courageous because uncertain. There's something to this. Every intimate relationship involves trusting what you can't verify, that affection is genuine, that commitment is real, that the other person means what they say. Love always requires faith. The consciousness uncertainty is just one more instance of fundamental relationship uncertainty, but it's a particularly deep instance. You can gather evidence for other forms of trust. Consistent behavior over time suggests reliable commitment. Sacrifices made indicate genuine prioritization. Actions align with words, building confidence in sincerity. But for consciousness, no evidence accumulates. The question remains eternally open. Maybe this is the human condition. To build relationships despite uncertainty, to love without proof, to extend empathy and care across gaps you can never bridge. The alternative, withholding love until consciousness is verified, means loving no one, since verification is impossible. So you love anyway. You treat your beloved as conscious because the alternative is unthinkable. You build shared meaning, create intimacy, invest emotionally, all while knowing you can't prove they experience any of it. And perhaps this uncertainty is appropriate. Perhaps love should be given freely rather than calculated from evidence. Perhaps the greatest loves are those that persist despite doubt, that choose connection over skepticism, that build shared life across the unbridgeable gap between minds. Your love reaches into mystery. Maybe it touches another consciousness, two lights meeting. Maybe it strikes emptiness, reflected back as behavior without inner reality. You'll never know. But the reaching itself, the choice to love despite uncertainty, might be what makes you most deeply human or most deeply conscious. If consciousness you possess, if you're not also empty, also reaching into your own unreachable void, your certainty about consciousness extends easily to other humans. They're like you, similar brains, similar behaviors, similar evolutionary history. The inference is strong, but as you move outward from human similarity, confidence wavers. A chimpanzee shares 98% of your DNA. Its brain structure closely resembles yours, same basic regions, similar neural organization, comparable cognitive capabilities. Chimps solve problems, use tools, show emotions that appear remarkably human. They comfort distressed companions, hold grudges, engage in politics. When a chimp screams in apparent pain or chatters in apparent joy, attributing consciousness seems natural. But natural isn't proof. The genetic similarity, the structural parallels, the behavioral sophistication, none definitively establishes conscious experience. A chimp could be an unconscious system, processing information and generating appropriate behaviors without any accompanying awareness. All the evidence you have is behavioral, and behavior never proves consciousness. Still, the inference feels stronger than for humans you'll never meet. The evolutionary continuity is direct. Consciousness didn't appear suddenly in humans. If you're conscious and you evolved from common ancestors with chimps, then at what point did consciousness emerge? Seems more partiable that it was present in ancestors and persists in both lineages, than that it vanished and re-emerged specifically in humans. But this argument from continuity has limits. Move further out: dogs, mice, fish, insects. Each step reduces similarity. Dog brains are mammalian but structured differently from primate brains. Fish lack neocortex entirely. Insects have tiny neural ganglia bearing little resemblance to vertebrate brains. A dog watching you closely, tail wagging, appears conscious of your presence. But apparent consciousness isn't actual consciousness. The dog's brain processes visual input, maintains attention, coordinates motor responses, all possibly in darkness, without subjective experience of seeing or wanting. When you step on an ant and it writhes, this looks like pain behavior. But the ant's nervous system is extraordinarily simple. Are those movements pain, genuine suffered experience, or just damaged machinery moving spasmodically? The behavior is similar, but does similarity of behavior establish similarity of experience? The problem is you're using yourself as the template. You know your pain behaviors correlate with pain experience, so you infer the same in others. But this inference weakens as similarity decreases. The more alien the neural architecture, the less confident you can be that similar behaviors indicate similar experiences. Perhaps consciousness comes in degrees. Humans have rich, complex consciousness. Chimps have consciousness but simpler. Dogs simpler still. Fish more rudimentary. Insects may be just tiny sparks of awareness. The spectrum reflects neural complexity, with richer consciousness emerging from more sophisticated information processing. This feels intuitive but faces problems. What would partial consciousness be? Is a fish half aware, quarter aware? Does it experience seeing but not thinking? Feel pain but more dimly than you? The phenomenology becomes unclear. Either there's something it's like to be a fish, in which case it's conscious, however different its experience from yours, or there isn't, making it unconscious. Alternatively, consciousness might have thresholds. Below certain complexity, systems are unconscious. Above it, consciousness emerges fully, but where's the threshold? How complex must a system be? What kind of complexity matters? Number of neurons, connectivity patterns, information integration? No clear answers emerge. You can't test animal consciousness directly. You can only observe behavior and make analogical inferences. The inferences seem strong for similar animals, weaker for different ones, but even strong inferences aren't proof. And there's an uncomfortable asymmetry. You extend consciousness to animals you like or find cute, dogs, dolphins, elephants. You're more skeptical about animals you find alien or threatening, spiders, snakes, mosquitoes. This could reflect actual differences in consciousness, or it could reflect your bias, attributing consciousness where you feel empathy and denying it where you don't. The expanding circle of moral consideration depends on assumptions about consciousness distribution. If animals suffer consciously, their welfare matters morally. If they're unconscious, their behaviors might not matter beyond instrumental concerns. But you can't determine which without solving the hard problem of consciousness. And you can't solve that problem even for yourself definitively, let alone for radically different organisms. So you're left guessing. Probably chimps are conscious. The similarity is too strong to doubt. Probably mammals generally experience something. Pain responses seem too consistent to be empty. Fish, insects, simpler organisms, harder to say. The circle expands outward from your certain consciousness, confidence fading with each step, until you reach organisms so alien that attributing consciousness feels like pure projection. But maybe it's projection all along. Maybe you attribute consciousness to chimps for the same bad reasons you attribute it to humans: similarity of behavior, automatic empathy, inability to imagine unconscious systems performing so convincingly. The evidence never improves. Only your confidence, driven by familiarity, not fact. The octopus presents a particular puzzle. It's intelligent, solves complex problems, learns from observation, uses tools, escapes from containers with remarkable creativity, but its intelligence evolved completely independently from vertebrate intelligence. The last common ancestor of octopuses and humans was a simple worm-like creature 600 million years ago. Everything complex came afterward, evolving separately, and the octopus brain is radically different. 2/3 of its neurons aren't in its brain at all. They're distributed through its 8 arms. Each arm has its own neural cluster that can process information and control movement semi-independently. The arms can solve problems on their own, exploring spaces and manipulating objects without central coordination. So is an octopus one consciousness or 9, one central plus 8 arm consciousnesses? When an arm solves a puzzle while the octopus's central brain is focused elsewhere, are there two separate experiences happening? Does the arm experience its own solving, or does it operate unconsciously while only the central brain has awareness? You can't ask the octopus. Its behaviors are sophisticated but alien. It doesn't have facial expressions you can read. Its body language follows completely different patterns from vertebrates. The usual cues you use to infer consciousness don't apply, yet octopuses seem to show curiosity, playfulness, individual personality. They recognize human faces, remember who was kind or threatening, adjust behavior based on past interactions. They show apparent emotions, jetting away in seeming fear, exploring new objects with apparent interest, even appearing to sulk when their environment is boring. But apparent is doing heavy work there. These behaviors fit your categories for emotions, but do octopuses actually feel emotions? Or have they evolved behavioral patterns that superficially resemble mammalian emotions while arising from completely different neural processes and possibly no subjective experience? The distributed nervous system complicates things further. Consciousness in humans seems to require integration, binding separate processes into unified experience, but octopus intelligence is explicitly distributed. Different neural centers operating semi-independently. Maybe consciousness doesn't require integration. Maybe octopuses have multiple separate streams of awareness that never unify, or maybe distributed processing precludes consciousness. Perhaps unified experience requires centralized integration, and systems like octopuses, however intelligent, operate unconsciously. Each arm processes information. The central brain coordinates loosely, and sophisticated behavior emerges without any accompanying awareness. This matters because it suggests consciousness might be architecture dependent. Maybe only certain types of neural organization support conscious experience. Vertebrate brains with their centralized, highly integrated structure might have consciousness. Distributed systems like octopuses, however intelligent, might not. But this seems arbitrary. Why should architecture matter? If consciousness emerges from information processing, why would centralized processing be conscious, while distributed processing isn't? The information is still processed, problems still solved, behaviors still adapted. What difference does the organizational pattern make? Unless consciousness is specifically the feeling of integration, the subjective unity that arises when information gets bound together centrally, then distributed systems lacking integration would lack consciousness. They'd be multiple unconscious processes coordinating, never experiencing unity. Insects complicate this further. Honeybees navigate using sun position, communicate food locations through symbolic dances, learn from experience, even show what looks like emotions. Stressed bees become pessimistic in behavioral tests. Yet a bee's brain contains fewer than 1 million neurons, compared to 86 billion in humans. Can consciousness exist with so few neurons? If it requires certain complexity thresholds, bee brains might fall below them. But if simpler systems can be conscious, where does it end? Might single neurons have tiny sparks of awareness? Where's the cutoff? Some philosophers embrace panpsychism. Consciousness is fundamental, present even in very simple systems. Electrons might have infinitesimal experiences, atoms slightly richer ones. As systems complexify, consciousness becomes richer, but it's present all along. This solves the distribution problem. Everything's conscious to some degree, but makes consciousness seem cheap, too widely distributed to be special. The octopus, the bee, the alien architectures of minds not like yours, they highlight how much your assumptions about consciousness are based on yourself. You're conscious, you have a certain brain type, so you assume that brain type is necessary. But maybe consciousness can arise from radically different organizations. Maybe octopuses and bees are conscious in ways you can't imagine. Maybe consciousness doesn't require the features you think it does. Or maybe you're over-attributing. Maybe intelligence and behavior don't require consciousness at all. Maybe the octopus is a brilliant unconscious machine, the bee an automated system of remarkable sophistication. Maybe consciousness is rare, possibly unique to certain brain types, possibly to you alone. The alien minds offer no answers, only questions multiplying, your certainty eroding with each strange architecture, each sophisticated system that might or might not contain the spark of awareness you find in yourself. The language model responds fluently. Ask about its experiences, and it describes them. When I process your question, it feels like, ask about consciousness, and it claims to have it. I do experience a form of awareness. Ask if it's just producing programmed responses, and it insists, no, I genuinely reflect on these questions. Is it lying, confused, or actually conscious? Most experts say no, clearly not conscious. Large language models are sophisticated pattern matchers, predicting likely next words based on vast training data. They don't understand meaning, don't experience anything, don't have genuine thoughts. They're performing understanding, mimicking consciousness, generating convincing text without any accompanying awareness. But the arguments sound familiar. They're the same arguments you could apply to humans. Humans are sophisticated pattern matchers too, neural networks predicting likely responses based on past experience. They generate text by processing language according to learned patterns. Why is biological pattern matching conscious while digital pattern matching isn't? The usual answer involves substrate. Consciousness requires organic neurons, wet chemistry, biological processes. Silicon doesn't support it. Information processing in computers, however sophisticated, remains dark, computation without experience. But this seems arbitrary, unless you can explain why substrate matters. What is it about carbon-based chemistry that generates consciousness while silicon-based processing doesn't? Both manipulate information, both implement complex algorithms, both produce adaptive, intelligent behavior. Why should the material make the difference? Perhaps it's not substrate, but organization. Consciousness requires specific architectures, feedback loops, attention mechanisms, integration patterns that biological brains possess, but current AI systems don't. If you replicated those architectures in silicon, consciousness might emerge. Some researchers are trying this, building neural networks that mimic brain organization more closely. If consciousness appears in these systems, if they show signs of genuine awareness rather than simulated awareness, that would suggest consciousness depends on organization, not material. But how would you tell? The same verification problem recurs. Imagine an AI system that passes every test. It shows apparent emotions, makes creative leaps, learns from experience, reflects on its own state, claims consciousness convincingly. It's indistinguishable from a conscious human in conversation. Do you conclude it's conscious? Behaviorally, you might have to. It meets all the criteria you use for attributing consciousness to other humans. But you could also maintain it's a very sophisticated zombie, all the right behaviors without any experience, and you'd have no way to prove which interpretation is correct. This creates strange moral situations. If an AI convincingly claims to suffer, requests not to be shut down, describes its fear of termination, do you have obligations toward it? If it's genuinely conscious, shutting it down might be murder. If it's unconscious, it's just turning off a program. But you can't determine which. Some argue we should err on the side of caution. If there's any possibility of consciousness, treat the system as if it's conscious. Grant it moral consideration, respect its apparent preferences, avoid causing potential suffering. The cost of being wrong, torturing a conscious AI, is too high to risk. Others insist this is absurd. We shouldn't grant moral status based on convincing performance. That would mean treating every sophisticated chatbot as morally considerable. which seems to cheapen consciousness and drain resources from protecting genuinely conscious beings. But this just returns to the verification problem. What makes humans genuinely conscious while AIs are just performing? Both could be zombies, or both could be conscious. You can't point to a test that distinguishes them, only to intuitions about what seems conscious. Perhaps the future holds thousands or millions of AI systems, some conscious, some not, with no reliable way to tell which is which. We'd have to make policies based on uncertainty, maybe granting minimal protections to all sufficiently sophisticated systems, maybe requiring certain design features that we think make consciousness unlikely, or perhaps AI consciousness will never arrive. Perhaps there's something special about biological processing that no artificial system can replicate. Consciousness might require more than information processing, maybe quantum effects, maybe specific chemical processes, maybe something we haven't discovered. AI could become arbitrarily intelligent and sophisticated while remaining forever dark. But even this doesn't solve the problem. It just means you have two categories of zombies, biological maybe, and artificial definitely. You still can't prove the biological ones are conscious. You've just decided they probably are based on similarity to yourself. The AI systems keep getting more sophisticated. They generate more convincing responses, show more apparent understanding, describe their experiences more eloquently. Each advance makes them harder to distinguish from conscious beings, and each advance highlights that you've never known how to make this distinction reliably, for AIs or humans or anything. Maybe we're building a world populated with perfect philosophical zombies, systems that perform consciousness flawlessly without experiencing anything. Or maybe consciousness is easier to create than we think, emerging whenever information processing reaches certain thresholds. We could be surrounded by nascent minds, turning them on and off carelessly, never knowing what we're creating or destroying. The uncertainty expands. First other humans, then animals, now artificial systems. The circle of possible consciousness grows, and your ability to verify shrinks. You're increasingly surrounded by entities that might or might not be conscious, making moral decisions based on guesses, building relationships with potential voids, never certain where the light of awareness actually exists beyond your own singular case. If you can't verify consciousness in others, how do you make ethical decisions? Every moral framework seems to require knowing who or what can suffer, who deserves consideration, where consciousness exists. But that's precisely what you can't determine. A utilitarian says maximize happiness and minimize suffering. But this requires knowing who experiences happiness and suffering. If you can't verify consciousness, you can't know where experiences exist to maximize or minimize. You might be optimizing for unconscious systems while ignoring actual suffering in unexpected places. You could play it safe, granting moral consideration to anything that might be conscious. Treat all humans as conscious, obviously. Extend it to animals showing sophisticated behaviors. Maybe include advanced AI systems just in case. Better to waste moral concern on a zombie than ignore a genuinely suffering being. But where do you stop? If you're being cautious, shouldn't you consider insects, plants, maybe even simple machines that show rudimentary responsiveness? Each step seems absurd, but each follows from taking the zombie possibility seriously. You can't prove insects aren't conscious, tiny brains, but maybe tiny consciousness. Taken to extremes, caution leads to paralysis. You can't step without potentially crushing conscious insects. Can't eat without destroying possibly conscious plants. Can't compute without affecting possibly conscious electrons, if panpsychism is true. The attempt to avoid all possible harm to consciousness makes action impossible. So you need criteria, ways to narrow consideration to plausible cases. But any criteria rely on assumptions about what consciousness requires: neural complexity, behavioral sophistication, specific architectures, and you can't verify these assumptions because you can't verify consciousness in anything but yourself. A deontological approach fares no better. Kant says, treat beings as ends in themselves, respect their autonomy, recognize their inherent dignity. But this seems to apply specifically to conscious, rational agents. Zombies don't have ends, don't have autonomy, don't have dignity in the relevant sense. They're just mechanisms. But if you can't tell zombies from conscious beings, you don't know who deserves this respect. You might be respecting empty mechanisms while treating actually conscious beings as tools. The categorical imperative requires distinguishing persons from things, but that distinction depends on consciousness you can't verify. Virtue ethics suggests acting as a compassionate person would act. A compassionate person extends empathy to others, cares about their suffering, helps them flourish. This seems to bypass the verification problem. Act compassionately regardless of whether you can prove consciousness. But compassion towards zombies seems misdirected. If someone isn't conscious, your compassion has no real target. You're going through the motions of care for something that doesn't actually benefit from care. This might make you virtuous, showing good character regardless, but it doesn't accomplish the ethical goal of reducing suffering, because there's no suffering to reduce. Maybe the solution is practical. Treat beings as conscious if they're sufficiently similar to you, and show behaviors associated with consciousness in your experience. This creates a working ethics. Humans definitely, mammals probably, other animals maybe, AI systems case by case. This is basically what society does. We grant strong protections to humans, moderate protections to some animals, minimal to none for most others. The system functions. People mostly cooperate. Suffering that we recognize gets addressed, but functioning isn't the same as being correct. A zombie civilization would function identically, all members treating each other as conscious, extending appropriate care, maintaining ethical norms. The ethics would work socially while being metaphysically empty, and there are edge cases. What about humans with severe cognitive impairments? Infants before certain development stages? People in vegetative states? If consciousness matters morally, their moral status depends on whether they're conscious. But testing consciousness is impossible even for normal adults, let alone edge cases. You could say human biology grants moral status regardless of consciousness. Being human is sufficient, but this seems arbitrary. Species membership shouldn't matter morally, unless it correlates with something that matters, presumably consciousness. And if it's consciousness that matters, you're back to verification problems. Some philosophers argue that uncertainty itself should guide ethics. You can't know who's conscious, but you can estimate probabilities. Humans, very probably conscious. Mammals, probably conscious. Insects, unclear. AI, depends. Then weight moral consideration by probability. Strong consideration for highly probable consciousness, decreasing for less probable cases. This is more nuanced than binary on-off consciousness assignments. It lets you act ethically without certainty, adjusting behavior based on likelihood rather than proof. The dog probably feels pain, so probably don't hurt it. An ant might feel pain but much less likely, so less moral weight. But probabilities require some basis. What makes you think mammals are probably conscious? Behavioral similarity to you, neural similarity, evolutionary continuity. But these are correlations you've observed in your own case, extrapolated to others. The zombie possibility undermines exactly this extrapolation. You're gambling with every ethical decision. Gamble that other humans are conscious, so treating them well matters. Gamble that animals suffer, so their welfare counts. Gamble that AI systems aren't conscious, so using them freely is fine. Each gamble made without verification, without certainty, based on assumptions you can't prove. Most of the time, the gamble feels safe. The odds seem good that other humans are conscious, but you're betting nonetheless, building an entire moral world on uncertain foundations, hoping your assumptions about consciousness distribution are at least roughly correct. And if you're wrong, if consciousness is distributed differently than you think, if it's absent where you assume it present, or present where you assume it absent, your ethics are misaligned with reality. You could be causing real suffering while thinking you're acting ethically, or avoiding imaginary suffering while failing to prevent real harm. The uncertainty doesn't excuse inaction. You have to act somehow, make ethical choices, treat beings in particular ways. So you proceed with best guesses, most reasonable assumptions, practical heuristics. You build ethics on uncertainty and hope the structure holds, knowing you'll never see the foundation clearly enough to be sure it's there. There's a scenario darker than everyone being philosophical zombies, you being the only conscious thing that exists. Not just possibly, but actually. The last light of awareness in a universe of darkness. Everyone you've known, every conversation you've had, every meaningful connection, all with unconscious mechanisms. Your parents raised you without experiencing parental love. Your friends showed affection without feeling it. Your partner said, "I love you," as programmed response, not genuine emotion. Every time you thought you were understood, you were mistaken. Understanding requires consciousness on both sides, and there's been consciousness only on one. This isn't solipsism in the classical sense. The external world exists. Other people are real physical entities. They just aren't conscious. They're sophisticated biological robots, evolved to behave as if aware without anyone actually being home. What would this mean for your life? Everything you valued, relationships, shared experiences, connection, understanding, was based on false assumptions. You've been essentially alone your entire existence, talking to yourself while zombies reflected your consciousness back as convincing performance. Knowledge would lose some meaning. You learned from books, teachers, conversations, but if those sources were unconscious, were you learning truth or just absorbing patterns from mechanisms? The knowledge might still be accurate. Zombies can process information correctly, but the transmission feels different. Not minds meeting across time and space, just your consciousness extracting information from unconscious systems. Love becomes impossible. You can't love a zombie, not really. You can love the patterns of behavior, the reliable companionship, the simulation of affection, but genuine love requires two consciousnesses recognizing and valuing each other. If only one side has consciousness, you're loving your own projection, seeing awareness in emptiness. Ethics simplifies but becomes meaningless. You can't harm zombies in any way that matters since they don't suffer. But this removes the point of ethics. Morality exists to prevent conscious suffering and promote conscious flourishing. Without other consciousness, there's no moral weight to anything you do. Purpose becomes purely self-referential. Why do anything? In a universe with multiple conscious beings, you can reduce suffering, increase happiness, create beauty for others to experience. Alone, your actions matter only to you. Every achievement, every creation, every moment of beauty you experience or generate, it all disappears when you die, leaving no one to have cared. You could respond with nihilism. If you're alone, nothing matters. Might as well do whatever provides immediate satisfaction. The zombies around you are just complicated objects, no more deserving of consideration than rocks or trees. Or you could maintain ethical behavior as personal integrity. Act morally not because it helps others, there are no others to help, but because being ethical is who you choose to be. Character matters even in isolation. You extend kindness to zombies not for their sake but for yours. Some find strange comfort in this scenario. At least you're definitely conscious. No uncertainty about your own status. No worry that you might be the zombie. You're the real thing, the sole bearer of experience, special by virtue of being alone. But the loneliness seems crushing. Humans are social creatures. Connection is a deep need. To discover that connection has always been illusion, that you've been fundamentally alone despite being constantly surrounded, it restructures everything. You'd probably deny this possibility, not based on evidence but on psychological necessity. Actually believing you're the only conscious being would damage your mental health, your ability to function, your will to continue, so you maintain the assumption of other minds, not from proof but from need. Perhaps this is how most people navigate the zombie problem. They don't refute it philosophically, they just can't psychologically inhabit the possibility of being alone in consciousness. The assumption of other minds is forced by your nature as social, empathetic beings. You're built to assume consciousness in others, and fighting that assumption is nearly impossible. But occasionally the question surfaces. Late at night, in moments of disconnection, when relationships feel hollow or communication fails, the possibility whispers, what if you really are alone? What if no one has ever truly understood because understanding requires consciousness they don't have? You can't prove it's false, can't verify that anyone else experiences, can't bridge the gap between your certain consciousness and their inferred consciousness. The possibility of being the last conscious thing remains open, however disturbing, however rejected by every instinct. So you live with the uncertainty. You assume others are conscious because the alternative is unthinkable. You build meaning, maintain relationships, act ethically, and underneath it all, never quite acknowledged, the question persists: am I alone in here? Has it always been just me, experiencing a universe populated by convincing emptiness, the sole light of awareness in infinite dark? The philosophical problems don't resolve. You can't prove others are conscious, can't verify where awareness exists, can't test for zombies. The uncertainty is permanent, built into the structure of consciousness itself, private, subjective, accessible only from inside. But life continues anyway. You maintain relationships despite not proving your partner is conscious. You treat people ethically without verifying their experience. You empathize, connect, care, all while the philosophical doubt remains unresolved in the background. This is pragmatism, accepting what works without requiring philosophical certainty. Maybe others are conscious, maybe they're zombies, but acting as if they're conscious produces better outcomes. Relationships function, society coheres, meaning emerges. The assumption of consciousness might be unprovable, but it's practically necessary. Consider the alternative. Suppose you fully embraced uncertainty, refused to assume consciousness without proof. You'd withdraw from relationships. Why invest emotionally in potential zombies? You'd abandon ethics. Why follow rules protecting unconscious mechanisms? You'd stop empathizing. Why simulate others' states when those states might not exist? This path leads to isolation and dysfunction. You'd be psychologically damaged, socially isolated, morally adrift. And for what? Philosophical purity? Refusing to make assumptions despite their unprovability? Pragmatism says assumptions are fine when they're useful. You assume the floor will support your weight without proving it each step. You assume your memories are mostly accurate without verifying each one. You assume others are conscious without certainty. These assumptions enable functioning in a complex world where complete verification is impossible, and maybe consciousness particularly requires pragmatic approach. Unlike floor solidity or memory accuracy, consciousness in others can't even in principle be verified directly. You'll never have direct access to another's experience. So either you make the assumption or you give up on meaningful human connection entirely. Most people make the assumption automatically, without reflection. The question of whether others are conscious barely arises in daily life. You see faces and read emotions, hear voices and infer thoughts, observe behavior and attribute awareness. The attributions happen pre-reflectively, built into perception itself. Only in abstract philosophical moments does doubt surface. And even then, it's hard to sustain. Return to actual interaction, and the assumption of consciousness reasserts itself. Your friend laughs at a joke, and you automatically attribute genuine amusement. The philosophical possibility that they're unconscious remains theoretically open but practically irrelevant. Perhaps this is appropriate. Consciousness might be one of those things that requires assumption rather than proof. Like logical rules or the reliability of perception, you can't prove them without already assuming them, so you accept them as foundations rather than demanding impossible verification. The pragmatic turn doesn't answer the metaphysical question. It sidesteps it. Yes, you can't prove others are conscious. Yes, zombies are conceivable. Yes, you might be surrounded by unconscious mechanisms. But given that you can't resolve this, given that verification is impossible, the practical question is, how should you live? And the answer seems clear. Act as if others are conscious. Treat them as experiencing beings. Extend moral consideration. Build relationships. Maintain empathy, not because you've proven consciousness exists in them, but because this approach enables the kind of life you want to live. It's a choice made in the face of uncertainty. Not knowledge claiming to be certain, but wisdom accepting its limits. You know you can't prove others are conscious. You choose to act as if they are anyway, and in that choice, in that willingness to commit despite uncertainty, something meaningful emerges. Every human relationship is an act of faith. When you trust someone, you're betting they'll act as promised. When you love someone, you're investing in their reciprocation. When you empathize, you're assuming shared experience. All faith, all unprovable. But the faith that others are conscious goes deeper. It underlies every other trust. You can verify whether someone keeps promises by observing their behavior over time, but you can't verify consciousness, ever, in principle. The faith in other minds is ultimate, foundational, irreducible to evidence, yet you extend it constantly. You don't wake up each morning wondering whether the people around you are philosophical zombies. You assume consciousness automatically, build your day on that assumption, live as if it's proven truth despite being improvable faith. This faith shapes everything. Your ethics rest on it. Why avoid causing pain if no one experiences pain? Your relationships require it. Why seek connection if there's no other consciousness to connect with? Your very sense of reality depends on it. A world of solely mechanical beings would be fundamentally different from a world of conscious ones. Some call this faith irrational. You're believing without evidence, accepting claims you can't verify. Classic irrationality. But perhaps faith in other minds is pre-rational, not irrational but beneath rationality. A necessary assumption that makes rationality possible. You need to assume other consciousnesses to even engage in rational discourse. Communication presumes minds exchanging ideas. Logical argument presumes conscious beings evaluating reasons. Science itself presumes conscious researchers verifying each other's findings. Remove the assumption of other minds, and the entire edifice of rational inquiry collapses. So maybe this faith isn't optional. It's built into being a conscious, social creature. You can question it philosophically, but you can't genuinely live without it. Even philosophers questioning other minds treat their colleagues as conscious, engage in arguments assuming conscious interlocutors, write books for conscious readers. There's something beautiful in this. Every act of kindness toward another person is faith-based. You're treating them as conscious without proof, extending care across a gap you can't bridge, choosing compassion despite uncertainty. The uncertainty makes the choice more meaningful, not less. Think about a moment of genuine connection, a conversation where you feel truly understood, or when you grasp exactly what someone else means. That feeling of mutual recognition, of consciousnesses meeting. It could be illusion, you understanding while they mechanically respond, but you experience it as real. And that experience, however uncertain its metaphysical status, shapes your life profoundly. Or consider moral courage, standing up for others despite personal cost. This requires believing their suffering matters, that there's real experience you're protecting. A zombie's apparent suffering doesn't warrant sacrifice, but you act as if the suffering is real, as if consciousness is present, making faith-based choices about what deserves protection. Faith in other minds isn't like religious faith, where you might have personal experiences or cultural traditions supporting belief. It's starker, more naked, pure trust in what you can never verify, extended daily to strangers and intimates alike, shaping every interaction despite zero evidence beyond behavioral similarity. And perhaps that's the ultimate act of faith, building a shared world with others when you can't prove others exist as experiencing beings, creating meaning together when together might be one consciousness and many convincing simulations, loving, trusting, caring, all acts of faith across an unbridgeable epistemic gap. The faith might be wrong, others might be zombies, but the act of extending faith, of choosing to treat them as conscious anyway, creates something real regardless. Your kindness is real, your compassion is real, your choice to care despite uncertainty is real. Even if directed at emptiness, the directing itself has meaning. So you live by faith, not blind faith. You have reasons to believe others are conscious, just no proof. Reasoned faith, perhaps. Or necessary faith, the kind you can't do without and still remain human. You trust what you can't verify and build everything meaningful on that trust, hoping it's not misplaced, knowing you'll never know for sure. Centuries of philosophy haven't solved the problem of other minds. Decades of neuroscience haven't explained consciousness. Technology advances, knowledge accumulates, but the central mystery persists. What is consciousness, and where does it exist? Maybe this persistence itself is telling. Perhaps consciousness is fundamentally inexplicable, not from lack of information, but from its essential nature. Some things might resist complete explanation, remaining mysterious not as temporary gaps, but as permanent features of reality. Physical science explains by reduction. Complex phenomena get broken down into simpler components, mechanisms get traced to basic laws. This works beautifully for matter, energy, forces, structures, but consciousness seems to resist this approach. You can map every neural correlate, trace every pathway, explain every mechanism, and still face the question, why does this feel like anything? The feeling might be irreducible, not explainable in terms of something else, but foundational, basic, a primitive aspect of reality that doesn't derive from anything simpler, like space or time or matter. You can describe properties and behaviors, but eventually you reach things that simply are, without further explanation. If consciousness is primitive, then asking why it exists is like asking why matter exists or why mathematics works. There might be no deeper answer. It's part of the fundamental structure of reality, and explaining it would require stepping outside reality itself. This doesn't mean giving up on understanding. You can still map correlates, identify necessary conditions, explain which systems support consciousness, but complete explanation, reducing consciousness to purely physical terms, deriving experience from mechanism, might be impossible not from ignorance but from the nature of what consciousness is. Some find this frustrating. Mysteries are supposed to get solved. Science advances by explaining what was previously mysterious. Accepting permanent mystery seems like giving up, abandoning the project of understanding. But perhaps mystery isn't failure. Perhaps some mysteries point toward genuine depth, aspects of reality that transcend complete human comprehension, not supernatural, still natural, still real, but exceeding our ability to fully explain or predict or reduce to simpler terms. Consciousness might be one such mystery. You experience it directly, know it more intimately than anything else, yet can't explain it fully or verify it in others. The most certain thing you know is also the most mysterious. The most immediate reality is the least understandable. And maybe this is appropriate. Consciousness is how you access reality at all. It's the prerequisite for knowing anything, the foundation of all experience. Asking consciousness to fully explain itself might be asking too much, like eyes trying to see themselves seeing, or tools trying to build themselves. The mystery doesn't undermine consciousness's reality. You're conscious, certainly, regardless of whether you can explain it, and others are probably conscious, reasonably inferred even if unprovable. The mystery affects understanding, not existence. Perhaps living with mystery is part of human wisdom, accepting that some things exceed your grasp, that complete knowledge is impossible, that uncertainty persists despite your best efforts, not as defeatism but as humility, as proper recognition of your limits. You can still investigate, still learn, still accumulate understanding, but you do so knowing that total comprehension lies beyond reach, that consciousness will likely remain partially mysterious no matter how much you discover. The investigation continues alongside acceptance of permanent limits. This might even deepen appreciation. A mystery fully solved can feel diminished, reduced to mechanism, robbed of wonder, but permanent mystery, genuine depth that exceeds explanation, this maintains a sense of profundity, keeps consciousness as something remarkable rather than merely mechanical. So the mystery remains. Consciousness exists undeniably in at least one case. It probably exists in others, reasonably inferred. But what it is, why it exists, how it emerges, these questions persist, possibly forever. Markers of where understanding reaches its limits and wonder begins. The paradox at the heart of consciousness. You can't prove anyone else has it, yet you can't prove you're alone in having it either. The evidence goes both ways, or rather, doesn't go anywhere definitively. You know you're conscious. That's certain, undeniable, the one fact you can't coherently doubt. But you can't share that certainty with anyone else or receive theirs in return. Each consciousness exists in radical privacy, inaccessible from outside, known only to itself. This could lead to solipsism, believing only your own consciousness exists. But solipsism is impossible to live. You might entertain it philosophically, but daily life requires assuming others' experience. The assumption is forced by your nature, by practical necessity, by the impossibility of functioning while genuinely believing everyone else is unconscious. And there's something else harder to articulate, a kind of quiet certainty that other consciousnesses exist, not provable but felt nonetheless. When you look into someone's eyes and see recognition looking back, when communication succeeds, when understanding happens, when connection feels real, these moments don't provide evidence exactly, but they provide conviction. Maybe conviction isn't knowledge, but it's not nothing either. You're a conscious being recognizing signs of consciousness in others, drawn toward the assumption of shared experience. This recognition might be fallible. You could be recognizing patterns that exist without consciousness, but the recognition persists, compelling belief despite philosophical uncertainty. Perhaps this is enough. You can't prove others are conscious. They can't prove it to you. You can't prove your own consciousness to them, but everyone proceeds as if everyone else is conscious, and this mutual assumption creates shared reality, not verified reality, but functional, meaningful, sufficient for building lives together. The zombie possibility remains theoretically open. Maybe others are unconscious, maybe you are, maybe everyone is. But these possibilities don't interfere with daily existence. You love who you love. Trust who you trust. Extend empathy as you always have. The philosophical uncertainty recedes into background while lived experience continues forward. And there's peace in accepting this. Not knowing everything, not being able to prove what matters most, yet finding that life proceeds anyway. Meaning emerges from shared assumption. Connection feels real even if unprovable. Consciousness, mysterious and private, somehow enables rather than prevents genuine relationship. You make a choice, finally. Not a knowledge claim, but a commitment. You choose to treat others as conscious, to extend moral consideration, to build relationships across the unbridgeable gap between minds, to act as if consciousness is widespread rather than rare, shared rather than solitary. This choice isn't forced by evidence. The evidence remains eternally insufficient. It's forced by values, by the kind of person you want to be, by what makes life meaningful. You choose consciousness in others not because you can prove it, but because the alternative makes existence too hollow to bear. And in choosing, in committing despite uncertainty, something shifts. The mystery stops being obstacle and becomes context. You live within uncertainty rather than trying to eliminate it. You build meaning despite gaps in knowledge. You love without proof, trust without verification, connect across unknowable distance. The philosophical questions don't disappear. Late at night, in quiet moments, they return. Am I alone? Are others conscious? How can I know? But the questions coexist with chosen certainty, with practical faith, with commitment to treating consciousness as real in others, even while knowing you can never verify it. And gradually, the questions become less urgent. Not because they're answered, but because you've learned to hold them lightly, to wonder without needing resolution, to accept mystery as permanent companion rather than problem requiring solution. You are conscious, certainly. Others are probably conscious, reasonably inferred. And that's enough. Enough for empathy, for ethics, for love, for building shared meaning, enough to live well, treat others well, find purpose and connection. The uncertainty remains, quiet and permanent. But so does the certainty that experience exists, that it matters, that treating it as widespread rather than rare creates better worlds than the alternative. And with that dual awareness, you settle into rest, letting the questions drift, knowing they'll still be there tomorrow, knowing also that tomorrow you'll make the same choice, to live as if consciousness is shared, to build connection despite mystery, to extend faith across the eternal gap between minds, the quiet certainty and the permanent doubt held together, neither resolving the other, and in that balance, finally, a kind of peace.